Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to the epic tale of one soul's journey across a world transformed by atomic fire. Tonight, we follow the path of the Chosen One, a tribal hero whose quest to save their dying village would reshape the fate of California and beyond. This is a story of courage in the face of impossible odds, of choices that echo across generations, and of hope blooming in the harshest wasteland. So settle into your shelter, let the desert wind carry your worries away, and drift into peaceful slumber as we chronicle every step of this legendary journey. Close your eyes, and let us begin in the struggling village of Arroyo, where desperation would forge a hero. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parched earth of Arroyo, illuminating a village caught in the slow embrace of death. Where once fertile gardens had flourished under the careful tending of tribal hands, now only withered stalks stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward an indifferent sky. The corn that had sustained generations of the Chosen One's people now crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, its leaves brown and brittle as ancient parchment. The Brahmin, those hardy, two-headed descendants of pre-war cattle that had adapted to survive the radioactive wasteland, lay dying in their pens. Their labored breathing echoed across the settlement like a funeral dirge, each wheeze and groan a reminder of the crisis that gripped every living thing in this sacred place. The animals that had once provided milk, meat, and labor for the community now struggled to lift their massive heads, their eyes clouded with the dull acceptance of approaching death. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all were the children, the future of Arroyo, who had begun to fall ill with mysterious sicknesses that no tribal remedy could cure. Their laughter, once the lifeblood of the village, had faded to weak coughs and listless silence. Mothers held their fevered young ones close, whispering prayers to ancestors who seemed to have turned their faces away from this place of suffering. The Chosen One had watched this decline for months, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over their shoulders like a shroud. At 20 years old, they had been raised on stories of their legendary grandfather, the Vault Dweller, whose courage had saved communities and changed the course of history. Yet, here they stood, powerless to prevent their own people from fading away like morning mist under the harsh desert sun. It was in this darkest hour that the village elder, her weathered face marked by decades of wisdom and sorrow, called the Chosen One to her dwelling. The adobe structure, once proud and well-maintained, now showed cracks in its walls that seemed to mirror the fractures appearing in the very foundation of their society. Inside, the air was thick with the smoke of sacred herbs and the weight of desperate hope. The elder's voice, though weakened by age and concern, carried the authority of someone who had guided her people through countless trials. She spoke of ancient knowledge preserved in the old computer disks, relics of the world that had existed before the Great War transformed everything into wasteland and struggle. These technological artifacts, maintained with religious devotion by generations of tribal keepers, held secrets that most wastelanders had forgotten or never known. Among these digital treasures was mention of something called the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a device of almost mythical power that was said to possess the ability to bring life back to the most barren and poisoned lands. The elder's description of the GECK painted it as nothing less than salvation itself, a tool capable of transforming the dying earth around Arroyo into the paradise their ancestors had dreamed of when they first settled in this place. But salvation, as the Chosen One was beginning to understand, always came with a price. The GECK was not simply waiting to be claimed by anyone desperate enough to seek it. According to the ancient records, it lay hidden in the legendary Vault 13, the sacred birthplace of the Vault Dweller himself. To reach it would require a journey across hundreds of miles of dangerous wasteland, through territories controlled by raiders, slavers, and creatures twisted by radiation, into forms that defied nature and sanity alike. The Elder made it clear that this quest would not be undertaken lightly or by someone unprepared for its demands. Before the Chosen One could be entrusted with the survival of their entire people, they would need to prove themselves worthy of such responsibility. This proof would come in the form of a trial as old as Arroyo itself, the Temple of Trials, a sacred testing ground where generations of potential tribal champions had either proven their worth or met their deaths in the attempt. The weight of this revelation settled over the Chosen One, like the gravity of their grandfather's legacy. They had grown up hearing stories of the Vault Dwellers' heroism, of impossible odds overcome through courage and determination. Now they faced the possibility that their own story might end before it truly began, that they might join the unnamed bones of those who had failed the temple's deadly tests. Yet as the Chosen One looked into the Elder's eyes, they saw not just desperation but faith, a belief that somehow, despite the impossible nature of the task ahead, they possessed whatever inner strength would be needed to succeed where others had failed. The Elder spoke of dreams and visions, of ancestral spirits who had whispered of a champion who would arise in Arroyo's darkest hour. The preparation for the Temple of Trials began immediately, though in truth, the Chosen One's entire life had been preparation for this moment. Every lesson in survival, every skill learned through years of living in the harsh wasteland, every story told by tribal elders about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, all of it had led to this threshold between their old life as simply another member of the tribe and their potential future as its savior. The night before the trial, the Chosen One sat alone beneath the stars that their grandfather had once navigated by, contemplating the strange turns that fate could take. Just days ago, their greatest concern had been mastering the intricacies of tribal politics or proving themselves in the communal hunts that brought meat to Arroyo's cooking fires. Now they faced the possibility of leaving everything they had ever known behind, perhaps forever, in pursuit of a salvation that might not even exist. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold, with that peculiar quality of light that seemed to promise either triumph or disaster with equal likelihood. The Chosen One made their way to the temple entrance, where Clint, the ancient guardian of the sacred site, waited with the patience of someone who had seen many young warriors approach this threshold over the years. His weathered face revealed nothing of what he thought about the Chosen One's chances, but his presence itself was reassuring, a link to the traditions and wisdom that had kept Arroyo alive through decades of hardship. Clint's role was simple but crucial: to ensure that no one entered the Temple of Trials unprepared for its demands, and that no one left without having truly been tested. He had seen the confident and the terrified, the skilled and the inexperienced, the desperate and the determined. Some had emerged victorious, their names added to the songs that tribal children learned by heart. Others had simply never returned, their fate becoming part of the temple's dark mystique. The temple itself stood like a monument to both hope and mortality, its ancient stone blocks fitted together with a precision that spoke of pre-war engineering knowledge far beyond anything the current inhabitants of the wasteland could achieve. The entrance yawned before the Chosen One like the mouth of some enormous creature, promising mysteries and dangers that would test every aspect of their character and capabilities. The first thing that struck the Chosen One upon entering was the strange quality of the air inside the temple. Cooler than the desert heat outside, but heavy, with an almost electrical tension that made the hair on their arms stand up. The stone corridors stretched away into darkness, their walls marked with carved symbols whose meaning had been lost to time, but whose power seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who walked among them. The temple's designers had created a gauntlet that would challenge not just physical prowess, but mental acuity, moral judgment, and the kind of desperate resourcefulness that separated true survivors from those who merely existed in the wasteland. Each chamber presented different obstacles, different tests, different ways to fail or succeed based on the choices made in moments of extreme pressure. The giant ants came first, creatures whose presence in the temple served as both guardians and symbols of the post-war world's twisted ecology. These were not the small insects that might have been found in the world before atomic fire transformed everything, but massive beings whose chitinous shells gleamed in the torchlight and whose mandibles could snap a human torso in half with casual ease. Fighting them required not just courage but intelligence. Understanding their movement patterns and behavioral responses well enough to exploit weaknesses that might not be immediately apparent. The rad scorpions presented a different kind of challenge, their venomous stingers carrying death that could strike from unexpected angles and distances. These creatures had learned to use the temple's shadows and stone formations to their advantage, turning every corner into a potential ambush and every moment of carelessness into a brush with mortality. Defeating them meant mastering not just combat techniques but the art of patience and observation that separated skilled hunters from their prey. But perhaps more treacherous than any creature were the floor traps that the temple's architects had cunningly concealed throughout its passages. Pressure plates that triggered deadly spears, concealed pits that opened into stakes, flame jets that could incinerate the unwary in seconds. These mechanical guardians had been waiting in perfect readiness for decades, their springs and triggers maintained by the dry desert air in pristine condition for any who might disturb them. The final test came in the form of Cameron, a fellow tribal who had dedicated his life to mastering the art of unarmed combat and now served as the temple's ultimate guardian. His presence transformed the trial from a test of survival against ancient traps and mutated creatures into something more personal and complex, a confrontation with another human being who possessed skills and determination equal to, or perhaps greater than, the Chosen One's own. Cameron's challenge could be met in various ways, depending on the Chosen One's nature and capabilities. Those skilled in the martial arts might face him in honorable combat, testing strength against strength and technique against technique, in a battle that would push both fighters to their absolute limits. Those possessed of silver tongues might attempt to convince him that violence was unnecessary, that wisdom and words could achieve what fists and feet might not. Still, others might seek alternative paths, using stealth or cunning to bypass the confrontation entirely. But regardless of the specific methods employed to overcome each obstacle, the temple demanded something more than mere survival. It required growth, transformation, the kind of fundamental change that marked the passage from ordinary tribal member to potential hero of legend. The Chosen One who emerged from the temple's final chamber would not be the same person who had entered its stone corridors hours earlier. At the top of the stone stairs that led to the temple's inner sanctum lay the ultimate prize and proof of worthiness, the Vault Dweller's jumpsuit, a relic of their grandfather's legendary journey that had been preserved in this sacred place for decades. The blue fabric, though faded by time, still bore the distinctive markings that had identified the Vault Dweller to communities throughout the wasteland. More than mere clothing, it represented a legacy of heroism and sacrifice that now passed to a new generation. The weight of the jumpsuit in the Chosen One's hands was both physical and symbolic, a tangible connection to the family history of courage that had shaped not just their bloodline, but the very foundations of post-war California's recovery. Wearing it would mean accepting not just the honor of their ancestors' achievements, but the terrible responsibility of living up to them in circumstances that might prove even more challenging than those the Vault Dweller had. Faced with the jumpsuits secured and the temple's trials completed, the Chosen One made their way back to the village, where the Elder waited with the mixture of hope and anxiety that characterized all those who sent champions forth on impossible quests. Her examination of their success was thorough but brief. The proof of their worthiness was evident not just in their survival, but in the subtle changes that the temple had wrought in their bearing and confidence. The Elder's final blessing was both benediction and burden, her words carrying the weight of an entire people's hopes and fears. She spoke again of the Holy Vault 13, of the GECK that might save them all, of the long and dangerous road that lay ahead. Her mention of Vic the Trader provided the first concrete step in what would prove to be an epic journey, a starting point in the vast wasteland where answers might be found, and the next stage of the quest revealed. The disc she pressed into the Chosen One's hands contained not just the technical specifications of their mission, but a reminder of what they fought for, the faces of children who might live or die based on their success or failure, the dreams of elders who had invested their last hopes in this desperate gambit. The weight of responsibility was almost crushing, but it was balanced by the knowledge that they had already proven themselves capable of extraordinary things. As the Chosen One prepared for departure, gathering supplies and making what might be final farewells, the entire village gathered to witness the beginning of their journey. The ceremony was simple but profound, acknowledging both the honor of being chosen and the very real possibility that they might never return. Parents held their sick children a little closer. Elders offered final words of wisdom, and friends exchanged promises that everyone hoped would someday be fulfilled. The journey eastward toward Klamath began as all epic quests must, with a single step taken in faith rather than certainty. Behind them, Arroyo continued its slow slide toward extinction, each day bringing new evidence of the crisis that would destroy everything they loved if their mission failed. Ahead lay unknown dangers and challenges that would test not just their survival skills, but their very understanding of what it meant to be human in a world transformed by atomic fire. The road stretched away into the distance, its dusty surface marked by the tracks of Brahmin caravans and the footprints of travelers who had passed this way before. Some of those earlier journeys had ended in success and safety, others in bones bleaching under the desert sun. The Chosen One's path would ultimately depend not just on skill and determination, but on the countless choices yet to be made, decisions that would ripple outward to affect not just their own fate, but the destiny of everyone they had sworn to save. As the sun climbed toward its zenith and Arroyo faded to a shimmer on the horizon behind them, the Chosen One carried with them the hopes of their people, the legacy of their grandfather, and the terrible burden of knowledge that failure would mean not just their own death, but the extinction of an entire way of life that had somehow survived the end of the world itself. The road to Klamath stretched across the California wasteland like a dusty ribbon, connecting one desperate settlement to another, its surface cracked and weathered by decades of atomic wind, and the passage of countless travelers who had walked this same path in search of hope, trade, or simply somewhere better than where they had started. The Chosen One's boots raised small clouds of radioactive dust with each step, creating a trail that would be erased by the next strong wind, leaving no permanent mark of their passage through this transformed landscape. The wasteland revealed itself gradually as the Chosen One moved eastward, each mile unveiling new evidence of the Great War's lingering influence on the natural world. Twisted metal sculptures that had once been automobiles jutted from the earth like abstract monuments to a civilization that had destroyed itself in nuclear fire. The skeletal remains of highway overpasses stretched across valleys where no roads remained, their concrete and steel frames serving now only as nesting places for the mutated birds that had learned to thrive in this harsh new environment. But it was the subtle signs of adaptation and recovery that proved most fascinating during the long hours of walking. Hardy desert plants had not only survived the atomic devastation, but had evolved new forms and colors, their leaves often bearing patterns that seemed to shimmer with their own internal light. Patches of green vegetation clustered around natural springs where the water ran clear enough to sustain life, creating small oases of normalcy in a landscape otherwise dominated by browns and greys and the peculiar purples that characterized irradiated soil. The wildlife that the Chosen One encountered during the journey reflected the same theme of survival and transformation that defined the post-war world. Geckos scurried across the path ahead, their scales glistening with patterns that would have been impossible before radiation rewrote the rules of biology. High overhead, the occasional hawks circled on thermals that rose from heated rocks, their cries echoing across canyons carved by flash floods and seismic activity that had followed the nuclear exchanges. As the hours passed and the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, the Chosen One began to understand something fundamental about the nature of their quest that had not been apparent while sitting safely in Arroyo's familiar confines. The wasteland was not simply empty space to be crossed between destinations, but a living entity in its own right, full of dangers and wonders that demanded constant attention and respect. Every shadow might conceal a predator. Every promising path might lead to deadly traps. Every source of water might carry contamination that could kill as surely as any raider's bullet. The approach to Klamath announced itself long before the settlement came into view, through a combination of scents and sounds that spoke of human habitation in this inhospitable land. Wood smoke drifted on the desert breeze, carrying with it the comforting aroma of cooking fires and the promise of civilization, however crude it might prove to be. The distant lowing of Brahmin reached the Chosen One's ears like a familiar song from home, reminding them that some aspects of tribal life had spread throughout the wasteland wherever people gathered to build communities. Klamath itself proved to be a collection of ramshackle buildings constructed from salvaged materials and whatever natural resources the local environment provided. Pre-war lumber scavenged from ruined structures had been combined with adobe bricks, corrugated metal sheeting, and even carefully shaped stones to create dwellings that prioritized function over beauty, but possessed their own rough charm. The settlement had clearly grown organically over time, with new structures added wherever space permitted rather than according to any grand architectural plan. The people of Klamath moved about their daily business with the unhurried but purposeful rhythm that characterized most wasteland communities, where survival depended more on consistent effort than dramatic action. Trappers checked their equipment and shared stories of recent expeditions into the surrounding wilderness. Traders examined goods spread on rough wooden tables, evaluating the quality and value of items that might have been worthless in the old world, but now represented precious resources. Children played games in the dusty streets, their laughter a reminder that life found ways to flourish even in the harshest circumstances. The Chosen One's first priority was locating Vic's home, the starting point mentioned by the village elder as the key to unraveling the mystery of the GECK's location. The building, when they finally found it after asking directions from several locals, presented an immediate puzzle that added complexity to what had seemed like a straightforward task. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the interior that suggested recent habitation but current emptiness. Stepping across the threshold felt like entering a riddle made manifest in physical space. Vic's possessions remained exactly where he had left them, tools arranged on workbenches with the precision of someone who depended on organization for efficiency, clothing folded and stored with care, food supplies carefully rationed and preserved according to wasteland survival protocols. Everything suggested a man who had expected to return shortly, yet the layer of dust on undisturbed surfaces indicated an absence measured in weeks rather than days. The mystery deepened as the Chosen One examined the details of Vic's abandoned life. His journal, left open on a table near the window, contained entries that spoke of successful trading expeditions and profitable deals struck with various settlements throughout the region. His maps, carefully annotated with notes about safe routes and dangerous territories, showed the accumulated knowledge of someone who had spent years learning to navigate the wasteland's ever-changing hazards. Most intriguingly, his most recent entries mentioned a significant transaction involving a peculiar flask that had caught the attention of buyers willing to pay premium prices for what most people would have dismissed as worthless junk. The search for answers led the Chosen One into the social labyrinth of Klamath's taverns, trading posts, and gathering places where information flowed as freely as the locally brewed alcohol, and where every conversation might contain clues to the trader's mysterious disappearance. The townspeople remembered Vic fondly as a reliable source of hard-to-find goods and equipment, someone who could be counted upon to deliver what he promised when he promised it. His reputation for honesty in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford made his sudden vanishing all the more puzzling and concerning. It was in the dim interior of Malamute's saloon, where the air was thick with pipe smoke and the low murmur of cautious conversations, that the Chosen One finally encountered someone who could provide concrete information about Vic's fate. The bartender, a weathered woman whose scars told stories of survival in a harsh world, had watched Vic leave Klamath weeks earlier with the confident stride of someone heading toward what he believed would be a profitable venture. His destination, she recalled, was the Den, a settlement with a reputation that made even hardened wastelanders speak in whispers. The Den's notoriety preceded it throughout the region like the stench of decay carried on desert winds. It was described as a place where the normal rules of civilization held no sway, where human life was bought and sold as casually as Brahmin hides or scavenged ammunition. Slavers operated openly in its streets, their merchandise displayed in pens that reduced human beings to livestock awaiting the highest bidder. Drug dealers peddled chemical escapes that offered temporary relief from the wasteland's hardships at the cost of sanity and health. Violence was not merely tolerated, but celebrated, with disputes settled through methods that prioritized strength over justice. The revelation that Vic had traveled to such a place added new dimensions of urgency and danger to the Chosen One's quest. A simple trading expedition had somehow gone catastrophically wrong, transforming a successful merchant into a missing person whose fate remained unknown but was likely grim. The flask that Vic had acquired, the same mysterious artifact that had somehow led the village elder to believe it was connected to Vault 13 and the GECK, had apparently proven valuable enough to attract the attention of people who had no qualms about taking what they wanted through violence or deception. But before departing for the Den immediately, the Chosen One recognized the wisdom of spending time in Klamath to better understand the local conditions and gather resources that might prove essential for the challenges ahead. The settlement, despite its modest appearance, possessed its own complex ecosystem of problems and opportunities that could provide valuable experience in the kinds of negotiations and problem-solving that seemed to define post-war life. The rat infestation that plagued Klamath's lower levels offered the Chosen One their first opportunity to demonstrate practical skills while earning both money and local reputation. The creatures had multiplied beyond the settlement's ability to control them through conventional means, creating a health hazard that threatened to undermine the community's already precarious existence. Their leader, a massive specimen that the locals had dubbed Kieng Rat, had grown to proportions that defied natural explanation and displayed intelligence that bordered on human cunning. The hunt for Kieng Rat led the Chosen One through the tunnels and basements that formed Klamath's hidden infrastructure, spaces where the settlement's founders had excavated storage areas and workshops below ground level to take advantage of the Earth's insulating properties. These underground chambers had become a parallel world where the rat population thrived away from human interference, creating elaborate nests and territories that reflected sophisticated social organization among creatures that most people dismissed as simple vermin. The confrontation with the giant Rat King proved to be more than a simple extermination job, requiring tactical thinking and careful planning to succeed, without suffering injuries that could prove fatal in a world where medical care was primitive at best. King Ra'at had survived to reach such impressive size by combining natural cunning with learned wariness of human hunters, making him a formidable opponent who would not be defeated through brute force alone. Victory required understanding his behavioral patterns, exploiting his territorial instincts, and using the underground environment's features as weapons in their own right. The successful elimination of the rat threat earned the Chosen One more than just payment in caps and supplies. It established their reputation as someone capable of solving problems that had stumped the local population and proved willing to take risks for the benefit of others. Word of their success spread through Klamath's social networks with the speed that characterized small communities where everyone's business was common knowledge. This reputation would prove valuable in accessing other opportunities for earning resources and gathering information. Derek's collection of books presented a different kind of challenge, one that required intellectual rather than physical skills to resolve. The old man had spent years accumulating volumes that ranged from pre-war technical manuals to collections of poetry, from historical accounts to practical guides for wasteland survival. His library represented one of the most concentrated repositories of human knowledge in the entire region, yet he lacked the organizational systems necessary to make his collection truly useful to those who might benefit from its contents. The task of cataloging and organizing Derek's books provided the Chosen One with their first extended exposure to the written legacy of the world that had existed before atomic fire transformed everything. Technical manuals revealed glimpses of the sophisticated technology and infrastructure that had once supported millions of people in comfort and safety. Historical accounts provided context for understanding how the Great War had developed from political tensions that seemed almost trivial compared to the devastation they had ultimately produced. Even works of fiction and poetry offered insights into the hopes and fears that had motivated pre-war humanity. Working with Derek's collection also highlighted the tragic extent of knowledge loss that had accompanied civilization's collapse. Many of the technical procedures described in the manuals required resources and equipment that no longer existed anywhere in the known world. Historical accounts referenced institutions and organizations that had been vaporized in the nuclear exchange. Cultural works celebrated values and achievements that seemed almost incomprehensible to people whose entire existence revolved around day-to-day survival. Yet, among the ruins of lost knowledge, the Chosen One found fragments that remained relevant and potentially valuable to contemporary wasteland communities. Agricultural techniques that could improve crop yields with minimal resource investment. Medical procedures that could save lives using materials available to skilled scavengers. Engineering principles that could guide the construction of more effective shelters and defensive structures. Each discovery reinforced the importance of preserving and sharing whatever remained of humanity's accumulated wisdom. Becky's brewing operation presented yet another facet of Klamath's economic ecosystem, one that demonstrated how entrepreneurial spirit could thrive even under the harsh conditions of post-war life. Her ability to produce high-quality alcohol at prices that undercut her competitors had made her establishment a popular gathering place, while also creating suspicions about the methods she employed to achieve such remarkable efficiency. The mystery of her cost advantages became a puzzle that required investigation and careful observation to solve. The answer, when the Chosen One finally unraveled it, revealed both the ingenuity and the moral ambiguity that characterized successful survival in the wasteland. Becky had developed relationships with suppliers that allowed her to obtain raw materials at below-market prices through methods that were not strictly legal but were not entirely unethical either. Her brewing techniques incorporated innovations that maximized yield while minimizing waste, achieving efficiency, gains that her competitors had not thought to pursue. Most importantly, she had cultivated a customer base that valued reliability and quality over the cheapest possible prices. Understanding Becky's operation provided the Chosen One with valuable insights into the economic networks that connected wasteland settlements and the complex relationships between supply, demand, and survival that governed trade in a world where traditional market mechanisms had been replaced by barter systems and personal connections. These lessons would prove crucial for navigating the more dangerous and sophisticated trading environments that lay ahead on their journey toward the Den and eventually Vault 13. The various jobs and challenges that the Chosen One tackled in Klamath served purposes beyond mere resource gathering and reputation building. Each task provided experience in different aspects of post-war problem-solving, from combat and negotiation to investigation and technical analysis. More importantly, these activities revealed the fundamental interconnectedness of wasteland communities, where individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire populations. The money that the Chosen One accumulated through their efforts in Klamath represented more than simple compensation for services rendered. Each cap earned was a step toward the resources that would be needed to purchase Vic's freedom from whatever fate had befallen him in the Den. The relationships built with local residents created a network of contacts who might provide assistance or information during future travels. The skills developed through solving various problems would prove essential for overcoming the more serious challenges that awaited further along the quest for the GECK. As the Chosen One prepared to leave Klamath behind and continue their journey toward the Den, they carried with them a deeper understanding of how post-war society functioned and what kinds of capabilities would be required to navigate its complexities successfully. The settlement had served as a relatively safe introduction to the broader wasteland's social and economic systems, a place where mistakes could be made and lessons learned without fatal consequences. The people of Klamath gathered to wish the Chosen One farewell, their faces reflecting a mixture of gratitude for the problems solved and concern for the dangers that lay ahead. Several offered advice about surviving the Den's notorious hazards, while others provided small gifts of food, ammunition, or equipment that might prove useful during the journey. These gestures of support served as reminders that even in the harsh wasteland, human compassion and community spirit could survive and flourish. The road leading southeast toward the Den stretched across terrain that grew progressively more ominous as the Chosen One moved further from Klamath's relative safety and civilization. The landscape itself seemed to reflect the moral character of their destination, with twisted rock formations and patches of discolored earth that spoke of chemical contamination and radioactive decay. The few travelers encountered along this route moved with the wary tension of people entering dangerous territory, their weapons prominently displayed and their eyes constantly scanning for threats. As the sun began to set behind them and the lights of the Den appeared as a sickly glow on the horizon ahead, the Chosen One reflected on how far they had already traveled from the desperate village where their quest had begun. The innocent hope that had characterized their departure from Arroyo had been tempered by experience with the wasteland's harsh realities, yet their determination to save their people remained undiminished. The challenges ahead would test that resolve in ways that the Temple of Trials had only hinted at, but the lessons learned in Klamath had provided tools and knowledge that would prove essential for survival. The approach to the den would mark the end of the relatively gentle introduction to wasteland life that Klamath had provided, and the beginning of a more serious confrontation with the darkness that lurked in the hearts of those who had abandoned all pretense of civilization. Vic's fate awaited discovery somewhere in that maze of corruption and violence, along with the next clue in the long chain that might eventually lead to Vault 13 and the salvation of Arroyo. The path forward was clear, even if the destination remained shrouded in uncertainty and danger. The approach to the den announced itself through a gradual assault on the senses that began miles before the settlement itself came into view across the wasteland's broken horizon. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burning chemicals and human waste, creating an atmospheric warning that this place existed outside the normal boundaries of civilized behavior. Even the wildlife seemed to avoid the area, with the usual desert creatures giving way to more desperate scavengers. Rats grown bold from feeding on discarded refuse, and carrion birds that wheeled overhead in patient circles, waiting for the violence that inevitably provided them with fresh meals. The structures that comprised the den had been built without regard for aesthetics or long-term habitability, assembled instead from whatever materials could be stolen, salvaged, or extorted from passing travelers. Corrugated metal sheets leaned against crumbling brick walls, while wooden planks bridged gaps between buildings with the kind of makeshift engineering that prioritized immediate function over safety or durability. The entire settlement seemed to exist in a state of barely controlled collapse, held together by desperation and the shared understanding that this place served purposes that civilized communities would not tolerate. As the Chosen One passed through the outer perimeter where guards lounged in whatever shade they could find, automatic weapons casually displayed as both tools and symbols of authority, the true nature of the den's economy became immediately apparent through the conversations that drifted from doorways and the transactions conducted in full view of anyone who cared to observe. Human misery had been transformed into commodity, with prices negotiated as casually as one might discuss the cost of Brahmin meat or scavenged ammunition. The Slavers Guild operated from a compound that dominated the settlement's central district, its walls topped with razor wire and its entrance guarded by men whose scarred faces and military bearing suggested backgrounds in organized violence rather than simple criminal opportunism. These were not desperate raiders driven to extremes by circumstance, but professionals who had chosen to make their living through the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. Their efficiency was evident in every aspect of their operation, from the well-maintained weapons they carried to the organized methods by which they processed and catalogued their human merchandise. The search for Vic led the Chosen One through streets where normal social conventions had been suspended in favor of a brutal pragmatism that recognized only strength and wealth as meaningful forms of currency. Vendors hawked goods that ranged from legitimately salvaged pre-war technology to items that could only have been obtained through murder and theft. Drug dealers operated from storefronts with the same casual openness that other settlements might reserve for Brahmin ranchers or equipment repair shops. Violence was not hidden or discouraged, but celebrated as entertainment, with crowds gathering around improvised fighting pits where desperate individuals battled for the amusement of spectators who wagered on the outcomes. The building that housed the Slavers Guild's operations was constructed like a fortress, its thick walls and narrow windows designed to withstand assault while providing clear fields of fire for defenders. Inside, the atmosphere was that of a business conducted with military precision, where human beings were evaluated and processed according to criteria that reduced complex individuals to simple categories based on physical capabilities, potential market value, and likelihood of successful conditioning into compliant servitude. It was here, in a cell that had been constructed with the same attention to security that other establishments might reserve for valuable equipment or dangerous animals, that the Chosen One finally located Vic. The trader, who had been described as reliable and competent, appeared diminished by his captivity, his normally confident bearing replaced by the hollow-eyed wariness of someone who had been forced to confront the worst aspects of human nature without the protective buffer of weapons or allies. Vic's story, when he was finally willing to share it through the iron bars that separated him from freedom, revealed the casual cruelty that characterized the Den's approach to business relationships. He had arrived in the settlement expecting to conduct straightforward trading negotiations, offering his skills in pre-war technology repair in exchange for goods and information. Instead, he had discovered that his expertise made him valuable not as a trading partner, but as forced labor, someone whose abilities could be exploited indefinitely without the inconvenience of fair compensation or voluntary participation. The work that Vic had been compelled to perform during his captivity involved repairing and maintaining the sophisticated equipment that the Slavers Guild required for their operations: radio systems for coordinating raids across Baal, vaste distance, medical devices for keeping human merchandise alive during transport, and weapons technology that provided tactical advantages over less well-equipped competitors. His technical skills had become a prison as surely as the metal bars that confined him, making him too valuable to release, but too dangerous to trust with anything approaching freedom. The conversation between the Chosen One and Vic had to be conducted in whispers and brief exchanges, with constant awareness that guards might be listening and that any sign of escape planning could result in immediate and violent consequences. Vic's refusal to discuss the mysterious flask that had brought him to the Den's attention was motivated not by stubbornness, but by the reasonable fear that revealing information might make his situation even more precarious than it already was. The suggestion to retrieve an old radio from his abandoned home in Klamath represented Vic's desperate attempt to purchase his freedom through demonstration of value rather than direct payment of the exorbitant ransom that Mezer had established. This plan reflected the trader's understanding of wasteland psychology, that showing potential future utility might succeed where simple monetary transactions had failed. The radio would serve as proof of his technical capabilities while providing the Slavers Guild with equipment that could enhance their operational effectiveness. The journey back to Klamath to retrieve the requested radio provided the Chosen One with an opportunity to process what they had witnessed in the Den and to plan their next moves with full understanding of the moral landscape they were navigating. The contrast between the two settlements could not have been more stark. Where Klamath represented humanity's struggle to build something constructive from the ruins of the old world, the Den embodied the opposite impulse, the descent into predatory behavior that treated other human beings as resources to be consumed rather than communities to be nurtured. The radio that Vic had described was exactly where he had promised it would be, carefully stored among his other possessions, with the kind of protective packaging that indicated both its value and his professional respect for the equipment that enabled his livelihood. The device itself was a masterpiece of pre-war engineering, its components crafted with precision that contemporary technology could barely comprehend, much less replicate. Transporting it safely back to the Den required careful handling and constant vigilance against the thieves and raiders who would recognize its worth. The return to the Den with the radio felt like descending once again into an underworld where normal human values had been systematically stripped away and replaced with a calculus based purely on power and exploitation. The guards at the Slavers Guild compound examined the device with the kind of professional interest that confirmed its potential utility for their operations. But their evaluation was tempered by the cynical awareness that desperate people often promised more than they could deliver. Vic's assembly of the radio into working condition was conducted under close supervision, with guards positioned to ensure that no component of the device could be weaponized or used to facilitate escape attempts. His work proceeded with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on successful completion of the task. Every connection checked and double-checked to ensure optimal performance. The moment when the radio crackled to life with clear reception was one of triumph, tempered by the knowledge that success had been achieved at the cost of demonstrating exactly how valuable his skills were to his captors. Metzger's response to the completed radio revealed the true nature of the den's business practices and the kind of cynical opportunism that had made him a successful leader in this environment of systematic exploitation. His laughter at the suggestion that a working radio constituted fair payment for Vic's freedom was not born of cruelty alone, but from the practical understanding that showing weakness or honoring agreements could undermine his authority among subordinates who respected only strength and ruthlessness. The demand for an additional 1,000 bottle caps alongside the radio transformed Vic's attempted purchase of freedom into a demonstration of how quickly the terms of any agreement could be changed when one party held overwhelming advantages in leverage and force. This was not negotiation in any civilized sense, but extortion, dressed up with the pretense of business transaction, designed to extract maximum value while maintaining plausible deniability about the essentially criminal nature of the entire operation. The sum that Metzger demanded was carefully calculated to be just barely within the realm of possibility for someone with the Chosen One's apparent resources, large enough to constitute genuine hardship, but not so enormous as to make payment obviously impossible. This represented sophisticated understanding of human psychology and economic pressure, the kind of expertise that successful criminals developed through years of experience in extracting wealth from victims who had limited options for resistance or escape. The money that the village elder had provided for the quest, while generous by Arroyo's standards, proved woefully inadequate for the realities of wasteland economics, where human life was literally priced according to market forces. This shortage forced the Chosen One to confront the harsh mathematics of survival in a world where good intentions and moral righteousness counted for nothing without the backing of sufficient material resources to translate ideals into action. The quest for additional funds led the Chosen One deeper into the den's maze of interconnected criminal enterprises, where every transaction carried moral implications and every source of income demanded compromise with principles that had seemed absolute when viewed from Arroyo's relatively sheltered perspective. The settlement operated according to an ecosystem of vice where each illegal activity supported and enabled others, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of corruption that made it nearly impossible to participate in the local economy without becoming complicit in its fundamental injustices. Gambling establishments offered opportunities to multiply existing resources through games of chance that were rigged in favor of the house, but not so obviously as to deter desperate players who saw betting as their only hope for acquiring the resources needed to solve their immediate problems. The mathematics of these games were carefully balanced to provide just enough winners to maintain the illusion of possibility while ensuring that the house's long-term advantage would transfer wealth from players to operators with mechanical reliability. Drug dealing represented another avenue for acquiring funds, though one that required the Chosen One to become directly involved in the distribution of chemical substances that destroyed lives with the same efficiency that the slave trade destroyed communities. The moral weight of participating in such commerce was balanced against the practical need to acquire resources for Vic's liberation, creating ethical dilemmas that had no clear resolution and no comfortable middle ground. Combat sports provided a more direct path to earning caps, pitting the Chosen One's fighting skills against opponents who ranged from desperate amateurs seeking quick money to professional brawlers who made their living through systematic violence. These contests were conducted with minimal safety precautions and maximum spectacle, designed to provide entertainment for audiences who enjoyed watching others suffer while wagering on the outcomes with the casual indifference that characterized the den's approach to human pain. The underground fighting circuit revealed aspects of the den's social hierarchy that were normally hidden beneath the surface of its criminal operations. Winners gained not only monetary rewards, but respect and status that could translate into access to better opportunities and protection from the casual predation that threatened everyone without sufficient power to defend themselves. Losers faced consequences that extended far beyond simple financial disappointment, often finding themselves indebted to powerful figures who collected on their losses through methods that made slavery seem humane by comparison. Each fight that the Chosen One participated in provided lessons in the kind of practical violence that governed relationships in places where law and civilization had been abandoned in favor of pure social Darwinism. Opponents employed every available advantage, from superior equipment and training to outright cheating and rule manipulation, reflecting the broader environment where success was measured only by results rather than the methods used to achieve them. The accumulation of sufficient funds to meet Metzger's demands required weeks of careful maneuvering through the den's various criminal enterprises, building relationships with figures who commanded respect through fear while avoiding entanglements that could prove more dangerous than beneficial. Every transaction carried risks that extended beyond immediate financial considerations to encompass potential violence, betrayal, and entrapment in obligations that could prove impossible to fulfill or escape. The gradual collection of the required bottle caps was accompanied by a corresponding accumulation of moral weight, as the Chosen One was forced to participate in activities that would have been unthinkable when viewed from Arroyo's perspective, but had become necessities dictated by the practical requirements of their quest. Each compromise with principle was rationalized through reference to the greater good that would be served by Vic's liberation and the eventual success of their mission to save their dying village. The moment when the Chosen One finally possessed sufficient funds to meet Metzger's demands was one of triumph, tempered by the knowledge of what had been sacrificed to achieve this goal. The bottle caps represented more than mere currency. They were physical manifestations of decisions made and lines crossed, of innocence lost and worldly wisdom gained through direct experience with humanity's capacity for both survival and degradation. The final negotiation with Metzger took place in an atmosphere charged with the tension of a transaction that both parties understood could easily turn violent if either side felt they were being cheated or disrespected. The Slavers Guild leader's examination of the payment was thorough and professional, reflecting his understanding that maintaining credibility in this environment required absolute consistency in following through on stated terms, regardless of personal preferences or changing circumstances. Vic's release from captivity was conducted with the same business-like efficiency that characterized all of the Slavers Guild's operations. A simple transfer of property from seller to buyer with minimal ceremony or acknowledgement of the human drama involved. The man who emerged from the cell was visibly changed by his experience, his confidence shaken, but his essential character intact despite weeks of degradation and fear. The information that Vic shared once he was safely away from the den revealed both the extent of his knowledge about the mysterious flask and the limitations of that knowledge in providing clear direction for the Chosen One's Beast's continuing quest. His connection to Ed, the Brahmin dealer, represented another link in the chain of contacts and relationships that might eventually lead to Vault 13. But it was a tenuous connection that offered no guarantee of success. The revelation that Ed operated in Vault City added new dimensions to the Chosen One's understanding of the wasteland's geography and the distances that would need to be traveled to continue their quest. Vault City's reputation as a bastion of pre-war values and advanced technology suggested that the next phase of their journey would bring them into contact with a very different kind of post-war community, one that had succeeded in preserving aspects of civilization that places like the Den had deliberately abandoned. The departure from the Den carried with it a sense of relief that was tempered by the knowledge of what had been learned and experienced in that place of systematic human degradation. The Chosen One's understanding of the wasteland's moral landscape had been fundamentally altered by direct exposure to organized evil, conducted with professional efficiency and social acceptance. These lessons would prove valuable for navigating future challenges, but they came at the cost of innocence that could never be recovered. The journey toward Vault City would provide opportunities for the Chosen One to process their experiences in the Den and to begin planning how the knowledge gained through that ordeal could be applied to the challenges that lay ahead. The quest for the GECK continued, but the person pursuing that goal had been changed by their encounters with the full spectrum of human nature in its post-war manifestations. Vic's gratitude for his liberation was genuine and profound, but it was complicated by his awareness that the Chosen One had been forced to compromise their own moral principles to achieve his freedom. This knowledge created a bond between them that was built on shared understanding of the sacrifices that survival sometimes demanded and the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances. As the Den faded into the distance behind them, the Chosen One carried forward not only the practical knowledge needed to continue their quest, but also the psychological burden of having seen humanity at its worst and having been forced to participate in that darkness to achieve their goals. The road ahead would test not only their determination and skills, but their ability to maintain their essential humanity despite everything they had learned about the world's capacity for cruelty and corruption. The journey from the Den to Vault City carried the Chosen One across terrain that seemed to transform gradually from the moral wasteland surrounding the slaver settlement to landscapes that hinted at the possibility of genuine recovery and reconstruction. The air itself grew cleaner as they traveled, free from the chemical stench and human degradation that had characterized their previous destination. Desert plants appeared healthier and more vibrant, their leaves showing the kinds of natural coloration that suggested soil and water sources unburdened by the industrial pollution of organized vice. Ed the Brahmin dealer had been easier to locate than anticipated, his reputation as a reliable trader having spread throughout the region's network of merchants and travelers who depended on accurate information about market conditions and supply sources. The man himself proved to be exactly the kind of straightforward businessman that the Chosen One had hoped to encounter after their experiences with the Den's more predatory entrepreneurs, someone whose success was built on honest dealing rather than exploitation of human vulnerability. The conversation with Ed about the mysterious flask revealed both the promise and the frustration that seemed to characterize every step of the Chosen One's quest for the Garden of Eden creation kit. Ed's memory of acquiring the flask was genuine but vague, limited to recollections of having found it somewhere along the trading routes that comprised what locals called the Big Circle, a network of established paths connecting the various settlements where Brahmin caravans could travel, with reasonable safety and predictable access to water and supplies. The Big Circle encompassed dozens of potential locations where the flask might have originated, from abandoned ruins and forgotten vaults to active communities that might possess additional information about its significance. This revelation transformed what the Chosen One had hoped would be a simple transaction into the beginning of another extended investigation that could consume weeks or months without any guarantee of ultimate success. But Ed's directions to Vault City carried with them implications that extended beyond the immediate practical concerns of the Chosen One's quest. His description of the settlement as a place where pre-war civilization had been not merely preserved, but actively rebuilt, suggested possibilities that went far beyond anything the Chosen One had encountered in their travels through the wasteland's more typical communities of desperate pack, survivors scratching out marginal existences from the ruins of the old world. The approach to Vault City validated Ed's descriptions, while simultaneously introducing new complexities that the Chosen One had not anticipated. The settlement's walls rose from the desert floor with the kind of architectural precision and structural integrity that spoke of engineering knowledge and construction capabilities that other wasteland communities could only dream of possessing. Guard towers positioned at strategic intervals were manned by soldiers whose equipment and bearing suggested military training, rather than the improvised defense arrangements that characterized most post-war settlements. The gate complex that controlled access to Vault City proper represented the Chosen One's first direct encounter with the kind of systematic bureaucracy that had characterized pre-war government institutions but had largely disappeared from the wasteland, along with the infrastructure and social stability necessary to support such elaborate administrative systems. The guards who processed visitors did so according to established protocols that prioritized documentation and official authorization over the personal relationships and informal negotiations that governed most inter-community interactions in the post-war world. The day pass system that regulated access to Vault City's inner districts reflected a level of social organization and population control that bordered on the authoritarian, with clear distinctions drawn between citizens who enjoyed full privileges and outsiders who were tolerated only under carefully regulated circumstances. The Chosen One watched as numerous travelers were turned away from the gates, their requests for entry denied on grounds that ranged from insufficient documentation to simple prejudice against their appearance or origins. The intervention of Wallace, one of the gate guards who had recognized the distinctive blue fabric of the Vault Dweller's jumpsuit, provided the Chosen One with an unexpected advantage in navigating Vault City's complex entry procedures. Wallace's knowledge of Vault history and his respect for the Vault Dweller's legendary achievements created an opening that might not have existed for ordinary wasteland travelers seeking access to the city's restricted areas. The recommendation to seek an audience with First Citizen Lynette represented both an opportunity and a potential trap, offering access to the highest levels of Vault City's power structure, while simultaneously placing the Chosen One under the direct scrutiny of someone whose authority was absolute within the settlement's borders. Lynette's position was clearly more than ceremonial, representing genuine political power backed by military force and administrative control over resources that made resistance or opposition extremely dangerous for anyone lacking equivalent support structures. The audience chamber where First Citizen Lynette conducted official business reflected the same combination of pre-war sophistication and post-war adaptation that characterized all of Vault City's most impressive achievements. Advanced technology that would have been considered miraculous by most wasteland standards was integrated seamlessly with practical administrative systems designed to manage the complex social and economic relationships that kept the BA settlement functioning despite the harsh realities of post-war existence. Lynette herself embodied the contradictions and complexities that seemed to define Vault City's entire approach to post-war civilization. Her obvious intelligence and administrative competence were balanced by prejudices and blind spots that reflected the insularity of a community that had achieved success through separation from, rather than integration with, the broader wasteland society. Her genuine concern for her people's welfare was coupled with casual dismissal of outsiders whose lives and struggles she viewed as fundamentally different from and less valuable than those of Vault citizens. The conversation between the Chosen One and First Citizen Lynette revealed layers of political and social complexity that made the den's brutal directness seem almost refreshing by comparison. Where the slavers had been transparently evil in their motivations and methods, Vault City's leadership presented themselves as moral and civilized while implementing policies that were arguably more destructive in their long-term implications for regional stability and human development. Lynette's explanation of Vault City's origins provided the Chosen One with their first concrete information about how Garden of Eden creation kits actually functioned in practice rather than theory. The revelation that Vault 8 had used its GECK to create the foundation for their entire settlement was simultaneously encouraging and devastating. Encouraging because it proved that the technology could indeed transform barren wasteland into thriving civilization. Devastating because it meant that each GECK could only be used once before its components were exhausted or repurposed for other applications. The knowledge that Vault City's GECK had been disassembled and its parts recycled into other projects represented a crushing blow to the Chosen One's hopes for finding a simple solution to Arroyo's crisis. Instead of acquiring a functional device that could be transported back to their dying village, they would need to continue searching for another vault that possessed an unused GECK, a quest that could theoretically continue indefinitely without any guarantee of success. But Lynette's offer of access to Vault City's central computer system provided a glimmer of hope that the journey to this settlement might not prove entirely fruitless. The database that contained information about other vaults could potentially direct the Chosen One to locations where unused GECKs might still be found, transforming their random wandering through the wasteland into a targeted search with specific destinations and objectives. The obstacle that prevented immediate access to this crucial information was Vault City's citizenship requirement, a bureaucratic barrier that reflected the settlement's fundamental approach to managing relationships between insiders and outsiders. Citizenship was presented as a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be claimed, with standards that were deliberately designed to exclude most applicants while maintaining the pretense of fair and objective evaluation. The citizenship test that Lynette described with such obvious satisfaction was clearly intended to be failed by the vast majority of applicants, serving more as a justification for exclusion than as a genuine assessment of qualifications for membership in Vault City society. The questions and requirements had been crafted by people who possessed advanced education and specialized knowledge, creating standards that were virtually impossible for typical wasteland survivors to meet, regardless of their intelligence or practical capabilities. Lynette's alternative proposal for earning citizenship through completion of a specific task represented a more honest acknowledgement of what Vault City actually valued in potential citizens, not education or cultural sophistication, but willingness to serve the settlement's interests, even when doing so required actions that contradicted normal moral principles. The mission she described was presented as a public service, but its true nature as a genocidal assault on a peaceful community was barely concealed beneath diplomatic language and bureaucratic euphemisms. The target of Lynette's proposed operation was described in terms that dehumanized its inhabitants, while justifying violence against them as environmental protection and public health measures. Her characterization of the settlement's residents as creatures, rather than people, reflected the same kind of prejudicial thinking that had enabled the worst excesses of pre-war society and had apparently survived the pre-war society's nuclear apocalypse intact within Vault City's carefully preserved culture. The specific accusation that these creatures were deliberately poisoning Vault City's water supply with radioactive contamination provided a pretext for violence that was designed to appeal to listeners' fears while discouraging deeper investigation into the actual facts of the situation. Lynette's presentation of the issue as a simple conflict between civilization and barbarism left no room for nuanced understanding of the complex relationships between different post-war communities and their varying adaptations to environmental challenges. The journey to investigate the alleged source of radioactive contamination led the Chosen One through landscapes that bore obvious signs of nuclear damage, but showed no evidence of deliberate environmental sabotage. The radiation levels in the area were certainly higher than normal background readings, but they appeared to be the result of historical contamination rather than ongoing pollution sources. The patterns of radioactive distribution suggested accidental releases rather than systematic poisoning efforts. The first glimpse of the settlement that Lynette had characterized as a threat to Vault City's survival revealed the enormous gap between official propaganda and observable reality. Instead of the barbaric encampment that had been described, the Chosen One encountered a community of individuals who had clearly made significant efforts to create livable conditions despite the environmental challenges they faced. The buildings showed evidence of careful maintenance and ongoing improvement projects, while the inhabitants moved about their daily activities with the purposeful dignity of people who had found ways to build meaningful lives under difficult circumstances. The encounter with Lenny provided the Chosen One with their first direct experience of communicating with someone who had been fundamentally transformed by radioactive exposure, while retaining all the essential characteristics that defined human consciousness and moral reasoning. Lenny's appearance was certainly shocking to someone accustomed to normal human physiology, but his behavior and personality were those of a civilized individual whose primary concerns centered on helping others and contributing to his community's welfare. Lenny's background as a pre-war doctor who had survived the nuclear apocalypse provided him with medical knowledge and historical perspective that few other individuals in the wasteland could match. His experiences in Necropolis during the Vault Dwellers' quest for a water chip created a direct personal connection to the Chosen One's family history, while demonstrating the continuity of heroism and sacrifice that linked different generations of wasteland champions. The revelation that Lenny had once considered joining the Vault Dwellers' quest, but had lacked the courage to do so, added poignancy to his current offer of assistance to the Chosen One. His willingness to help with their mission represented both practical support and a form of redemption for his earlier failure to act when confronted with opportunities for heroic service. This psychological dimension of their relationship created bonds of mutual respect that transcended the obvious physical differences between human and ghoul. The other inhabitants of the settlement that the Chosen One encountered during their investigation reinforced the impression that Lynette's characterizations had been based on prejudice rather than accurate observation. Harold, despite his unusual appearance as a mutant whose body had been colonized by plant growth, demonstrated intelligence and moral reasoning that were clearly superior to those of many apparently normal humans the Chosen One had met during their travels through the wasteland. Harold's explanation of the actual situation regarding radioactive contamination revealed the complex technical and political factors that Lynette had either ignored or deliberately misrepresented in her briefing. The atomic reactor that powered the settlement was indeed damaged and potentially dangerous, but the residents were actively working to repair it rather than using it as a weapon against their neighbors. Their inability to complete necessary repairs was due to lack of resources rather than malicious intent. The critical component that the reactor required for safe operation, a hydroelectric magnetosphere regulator, was available only from Vault City itself, creating a situation where the settlement's residents were dependent on the cooperation of people who viewed them as subhuman creatures worthy only of extermination. This dependency represented a form of structural violence that was arguably more destructive than any direct military assault could have been. Harold's analysis of Vault City's political motivations for maintaining the current crisis, rather than providing humanitarian assistance, revealed sophisticated understanding of power, dynamics, and resource competition that contradicted stereotypes about mutant intelligence and reasoning capabilities. His prediction that Vault City would eventually use force to seize the reactor and enslave the settlement's population reflected realistic assessment of expansionist policies rather than paranoid fantasizing about imaginary threats. The moral complexity of the situation that the Chosen One had uncovered made Lynette's original mission impossible to complete as originally conceived, while maintaining any pretense of ethical behavior. The choice between gaining Vault City citizenship through genocide and finding alternative approaches to accessing the central computer's database represented a fundamental test of character that would define not only the immediate success of their quest, but the kind of person they were becoming through their experiences in the post-war world. The decision to return to Vault City with Lenny as a companion served multiple purposes beyond simple transportation convenience. Lenny's presence would provide visible proof that the settlement's inhabitants were individuals capable of normal social relationships rather than mindless creatures driven by hostile instincts. His medical knowledge and historical perspective could prove valuable assets for future challenges, while his willingness to brave the dangers of travel with the Chosen One demonstrated the kind of loyalty and courage that made the best possible foundation for lasting friendship. The reception that the Chosen One and Lenny received upon their return to Vault City provided clear demonstration of the prejudices and blind spots that characterized the settlement's approach to inter-community relations. The guards' treatment of Lenny as a threat rather than a guest reflected trained responses based on dehumanizing propaganda rather than individual assessment of actual behavior or intentions. The requirement that he wait outside the city walls while armed guards monitored his every movement created an atmosphere of tension and mutual suspicion that made productive negotiations unnecessarily difficult. Lynette's refusal to listen to alternative explanations or consider solutions that might address the underlying technical problems without requiring violence demonstrated the kind of ideological rigidity that often characterized communities that had achieved success through isolation rather than cooperation. Her investment in viewing the situation as a simple conflict between good and evil made compromise or creative problem-solving appear to be signs of weakness rather than wisdom. The intervention of McClure, the senior council member whose authority was sufficient to override Lynette's objections, represented the Chosen One's first encounter with the internal political dynamics that shaped Vault City's decision-making processes. McClure's willingness to authorize provision of the required reactor component reflected both practical understanding of regional stability issues and moral recognition that genocide was an inappropriate response to technical problems that could be solved through cooperation and resource sharing. The successful repair of the atomic reactor transformed a potential environmental disaster into a source of clean energy that could benefit the entire region while eliminating the public health concerns that had provided justification for Lynette's proposed military action. The improved lighting and power systems that resulted from the reactor's restoration created visible evidence that cooperation between different communities could produce outcomes superior to those achievable through conquest or destruction. But Harold's concerns about Vault City's long-term intentions toward his community reflected realistic assessment of expansionist policies that would continue to pose threats regardless of short-term technical solutions. The settlement's location and resources made it an attractive target for annexation, while its inhabitants' status as mutants provided convenient justification for treating them as property rather than autonomous individuals with rights to self-determination. The negotiation of a formal trade agreement between the two communities represented the Chosen One's most significant achievement in the realm of diplomacy and conflict resolution, creating structures for ongoing cooperation that could prevent future crises while providing both sides with access to resources and capabilities they could not develop independently. The exchange of electrical power for medical supplies addressed real needs on both sides, while establishing precedents for peaceful resolution of inter-community disputes. The successful completion of this diplomatic mission earned the Chosen One the Vault City citizenship that had been promised, providing access to the central computer database that contained crucial information about other Vault locations. But more importantly, it demonstrated that alternatives to violence and exploitation were possible even in situations where such approaches seemed to be the only available options. The exploration of Vault 8's interior provided the Chosen One with their first extended exposure to pre-war technology and social organization preserved in functional condition rather than ruins and fragments. The clean corridors, advanced computer systems, and sophisticated life support infrastructure represented achievements that contemporary wasteland communities could barely imagine, much less replicate with their limited resources and technical knowledge. The central computer's database contained detailed records of Vault construction projects and resource allocation that painted a comprehensive picture of Vault Tech's massive pre-war infrastructure development program. The scope of the company's operations and the number of experimental facilities they had constructed suggested possibilities for finding unused GECKs that were far more promising than the Chosen One had dared to hope when beginning their quest. Among the Vault locations listed in the database was one that stood out as particularly promising, Vault 15, which had been sealed with a GECK and was located within reasonable traveling distance of Vault City. If the GECK remained unused and the Vault's inhabitants had not followed Vault 8's example of converting their device into community infrastructure, it might represent the solution to Arroyo's crisis that the Chosen One had been seeking throughout their long journey across the wasteland. The preparation for departure from Vault City was complicated by the relationships that had been formed and the obligations that had been incurred during the Chosen One's time in the settlement. Lenny's friendship and his offer of continued assistance created both opportunities and responsibilities that would influence future decisions about travel routes and mission priorities. The trade agreement that had been negotiated would require ongoing maintenance and oversight to ensure that both communities continued to benefit from their cooperative relationship. The journey toward Vault 15 would take the Chosen One through territories that were unfamiliar and potentially dangerous, requiring careful planning and resource management to ensure safe arrival at their destination. The map coordinates provided by Vault 8's computer were precise, but offered no information about current conditions at the target location or the challenges that might be encountered along the route. As the Chosen One prepared to leave Vault City behind and continue their quest for the Garden of Eden creation kit, they carried with them not only the practical knowledge and resources gained through their experiences, but also a deeper understanding of the moral complexities that characterized relationships between different post-war communities. The lessons learned about prejudice, cooperation, and the possibilities for peaceful resolution of conflicts would prove essential for navigating the challenges that lay ahead on their journey toward Vault 15 and whatever revelations awaited them there. The road northeast from Vault City toward the settlement that Lynette had described in such damning terms wound through terrain that bore the unmistakable scars of atomic devastation, yet also showed clear signs of nature's remarkable capacity for adaptation and recovery. The landscape itself seemed to tell the story of the Great War's aftermath, patches of earth where nothing would grow standing beside areas where mutated plant life had created entirely new ecosystems that possessed their own harsh beauty. As the Chosen One approached what the Vault City maps identified as Gecko, the first indication that Lynette's briefing had been less than accurate came through subtle environmental observations that contradicted her narrative of deliberate ecological sabotage. The radiation levels in the area were certainly elevated above normal background readings, but the patterns of contamination suggested accidental releases from damaged infrastructure rather than systematic attempts to poison neighboring communities. The settlement that came into view as the Chosen One crested a low ridge was nothing like the barbaric encampment that Vault City's propaganda had described. Instead of ramshackle structures thrown together by creatures too primitive to understand basic construction principles, Gecko revealed itself as a community where intelligent beings had made thoughtful adaptations to challenging environmental conditions. The building showed evidence of ongoing maintenance and improvement projects, while carefully tended gardens demonstrated that the inhabitants understood sustainable agriculture despite their harsh circumstances. The first resident of Gecko that the Chosen One encountered was tending to one of these gardens, his movements deliberate and precise as he examined plants for signs of disease or nutritional deficiency. When he turned toward the approaching visitor, his face revealed the characteristic features of ghoulification: skin transformed by radiation into a leather-like texture, hair long since lost to cellular damage, eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Yet his expression was one of curiosity rather than hostility, intelligence rather than primitive aggression. This was Lenny, whose gentle demeanor and obvious concern for his community's welfare immediately challenged every assumption that Vault City's leadership had encouraged the Chosen One to make about Gecko's inhabitants. His greeting was warm and welcoming, reflecting the kind of social grace that supposedly civilized communities often failed to demonstrate towards strangers. His offer of assistance was genuine rather than calculating, motivated by simple human decency rather than expectations of reciprocal benefit. The conversation that developed between the Chosen One and Lenny revealed layers of history and personal experience that transformed abstract political conflicts into deeply human stories of survival and adaptation. Lenny's background as a pre-war physician provided him with medical knowledge and scientific understanding that had proven invaluable to his community's efforts to cope with their radioactive environment. His memories of the world before atomic fire gave him perspective on both what had been lost and what remained worth preserving. Most significantly, Lenny's connection to the Vault Dweller created an unexpected bridge between the Chosen One's family legacy and the current crisis in Gecko. His recollections of that legendary hero's visit to Necropolis decades earlier provided personal testimony about the Vault Dweller's character and methods, confirming that the stories told in Arroyo were based on actual events rather than mythologized propaganda. The regret in Lenny's voice as he described his failure to join the Vault Dweller's quest revealed depths of character that contradicted every stereotype about ghoul psychology and motivation. Lenny's willingness to accompany the Chosen One back to Vault City, despite knowing the risks involved, demonstrated courage that few supposedly normal humans would have displayed under similar circumstances. His decision reflected not just personal loyalty, but recognition that sometimes individual safety had to be sacrificed for the greater good of inter-community relations and peaceful conflict resolution. The journey back to Vault City with Lenny as a companion provided the Chosen One with extended opportunities to observe how radiation exposure had affected not just physical appearance, but cognitive and emotional capabilities. Lenny's conversation revealed no diminishment of intelligence or moral reasoning, while his knowledge of medical procedures and scientific principles clearly exceeded that of most wasteland survivors who had not suffered ghoulification. His personality traits, compassion, humor, dedication to helping others, remained fully intact despite the radical transformation of his physical form. The reception that awaited the Chosen One and Lenny at Vault City's gates provided stark demonstration of how prejudice and propaganda could override direct observation and rational assessment. The guards' treatment of Lenny as a dangerous creature, rather than a peaceful visitor, reflected trained responses based on dehumanizing stereotypes rather than individual evaluation of actual behavior. Their insistence that he remain outside the city walls while under armed surveillance created an atmosphere of tension that made diplomatic negotiations unnecessarily difficult. The meeting with Lynette that followed revealed the depth of ideological commitment that made rational discussion of alternative solutions nearly impossible. Her refusal to consider evidence that contradicted her preconceptions about Gecko's inhabitants reflected the kind of intellectual rigidity that often characterized isolated communities, whose success depended on maintaining clear distinctions between insiders and outsiders. Her investment in viewing the radiation crisis as proof of mutant malevolence rather than technical malfunction made compromise appear to be a form of moral weakness. The intervention of McClure, whose authority within Vault City's political hierarchy was sufficient to override Lynette's objections, represented the Chosen One's first encounter with leadership that prioritized practical problem-solving over ideological purity. McClure's willingness to provide the hydroelectric magnetosphere regulator reflected both understanding of regional stability issues and recognition that cooperation might produce better outcomes than conquest or destruction. The successful acquisition of the critical reactor component marked a turning point in the Chosen One's understanding of how political change could be achieved in complex social situations where multiple competing interests had to be balanced against each other. McClure's decision demonstrated that even within authoritarian systems, individual leaders might be willing to act ethically when presented with compelling evidence and persuasive arguments for alternative approaches. The return journey to Gecko with the precious reactor component provided opportunities for the Chosen One to deepen their understanding of Lenny's character and the philosophical questions raised by ghoulification as a form of human adaptation to post-war conditions. Lenny's perspective on his own transformation revealed acceptance of physical change combined with determination to maintain moral and intellectual standards that defined personal identity in ways that transcended mere biological characteristics. The celebration that greeted their arrival in Gecko reflected the genuine community spirit that characterized the settlement despite the challenges its inhabitants faced. Harold's gratitude for the reactor component was expressed not just in terms of immediate practical benefits, but as validation of his community's worth and dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization by their neighbors. The successful repair of the atomic reactor represented more than technical achievement. It demonstrated that cooperation between different types of post-war communities was possible when mutual respect replaced prejudice and fear. Harold himself proved to be one of the most remarkable individuals that the Chosen One had encountered during their travels through the wasteland. His appearance as a mutant whose body had been colonized by plant growth was certainly shocking, but his intelligence and moral reasoning were clearly superior to those of many apparently normal humans. His leadership of Gecko reflected both practical competence and genuine concern for his followers' welfare, qualities that supposedly civilized communities often failed to demonstrate in their treatment of vulnerable populations. The technical explanation that Harold provided for the reactor crisis revealed sophisticated understanding of nuclear engineering principles that contradicted stereotypes about mutant intellectual capabilities. His analysis of the equipment failure that had caused radioactive contamination demonstrated that the crisis was entirely accidental, resulting from normal wear and deterioration, rather than deliberate sabotage or environmental terrorism. More importantly, Harold's assessment of Vault City's political motivations for maintaining the crisis, rather than providing humanitarian assistance, revealed realistic understanding of power dynamics and resource competition. His prediction that Vault City would eventually attempt to seize Gecko's reactor and enslave its population reflected careful analysis of expansionist policies rather than paranoid fantasy about imaginary threats. The repair work on the atomic reactor required both technical expertise and careful coordination between human and ghoul workers, creating opportunities for the Chosen One to observe how different types of post-war survivors could collaborate effectively when artificial barriers were removed. The successful restoration of the reactor's safety systems eliminated the radioactive contamination that had provided Vault City with justification for viewing Gecko as an environmental threat, while demonstrating the settlement's commitment to responsible resource management. But Harold's concerns about long-term security reflected realistic assessment of ongoing threats that technical solutions could not address. Gecko's location and resources made it an attractive target for annexation by expansionist neighbors, while its inhabitants' status as mutants provided convenient legal and moral justification for treating them as property, rather than autonomous individuals with rights to self-determination. The negotiation of a formal trade agreement between Gecko and Vault City represented the Chosen One's most significant achievement in the realm of diplomacy and conflict resolution. The arrangement that provided electrical power to Vault City in exchange for medical supplies addressed genuine needs on both sides, while creating structures for ongoing cooperation that could prevent future crises. More importantly, it established precedents for peaceful resolution of inter-community disputes that could serve as models for other wasteland settlements. The successful completion of this diplomatic mission demonstrated that alternatives to violence and exploitation were possible, even in situations where such approaches seemed to be the only available options. The trade agreement created economic incentives for maintaining peaceful relationships while providing both communities with access to resources and capabilities they could not develop independently. The citizenship status that the Chosen One earned through resolving the Gecko crisis provided access to Vault City's central computer database. But more importantly, it demonstrated that outsiders could earn recognition and respect through actions that served the broader community's interests. This achievement represented validation of meritocratic principles that transcended artificial distinctions based on origin, appearance, or cultural background. The exploration of Vault 8's central computer revealed detailed information about other Vault locations that had been constructed as part of Vault-Tech's massive pre-war infrastructure development program. Among these facilities was Vault 15, which had been sealed with a Garden of Eden creation kit and was located within reasonable traveling distance. This discovery provided the Chosen One with their first concrete lead toward a potential solution for Arroyo's crisis since beginning their quest weeks earlier. The database also contained technical specifications and operational procedures for GECK devices that helped the Chosen One understand both their capabilities and limitations. The revelation that each GECK could only be used once before its components were exhausted or repurposed explained why Vault City could not provide direct assistance to Arroyo despite possessing advanced technology and manufacturing capabilities. This knowledge clarified the parameters of the Chosen One's quest, while confirming that finding an unused GECK remained their only viable option for saving their dying village. The relationships that the Chosen One had developed during their time in the Vault City region created both opportunities and obligations that would influence future decision-making. Lenny's friendship and his offer of continued assistance represented valuable assets for the challenges ahead, while the diplomatic agreements that had been negotiated would require ongoing attention to ensure their successful implementation. The moral lessons learned through exposure to prejudice and its consequences provided the Chosen One with deeper understanding of how fear and ignorance could be used to justify terrible actions against innocent people. The contrast between Vault City's propaganda about Gecko's inhabitants and the reality of their character and behavior served as a powerful reminder that official narratives often reflected political convenience rather than objective truth. The successful resolution of the conflict between Vault City and Gecko demonstrated that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire communities, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond immediate circumstances. The Chosen One's willingness to challenge authority and advocate for peaceful solutions had prevented a genocide while establishing foundations for ongoing cooperation between previously hostile groups. The technical knowledge gained through observing the reactor repair process provided valuable insights into pre-war technology and its contemporary applications. Understanding how atomic power systems functioned and what kinds of maintenance they required would prove useful for future encounters with similar installations, while the experience of coordinating complex technical projects offered lessons in leadership and resource management. The journey toward Vault 15 would take the Chosen One through unfamiliar territory where the lessons learned in the Vault City region would be tested against new challenges and different forms of moral complexity. The success achieved through diplomacy and cooperation with Gecko's inhabitants provided encouragement that similar approaches might prove effective in other situations, while the resources and allies acquired during this phase of the quest would prove valuable for overcoming obstacles that lay ahead. As the Chosen One prepared to leave the Vault City region behind, they carried with them not just the practical knowledge and material resources gained through their experiences, but also a deeper understanding of human nature and the possibilities for positive change, even in the harshest circumstances. The transformation of enemies into allies through patient effort and moral courage had demonstrated that the wasteland's future did not have to be defined by conflict and exploitation, but could instead be shaped by cooperation and mutual respect. The road toward Vault 15 stretched ahead through landscapes that would test both the Chosen One's survival skills and their commitment to the principles that had guided their actions in previous challenges. The quest for the Garden of Eden creation kit continued, but the person pursuing that goal had been fundamentally changed by their encounters with both the best and worst aspects of post-war human nature. The road south from Vault City toward the coordinates that the central computer had provided for Vault 15 stretched across terrain that seemed to grow progressively more desolate and threatening with each mile traveled. The landscape bore scars from the Great War that were deeper and more extensive than anything the Chosen One had previously encountered, with vast stretches of glassed earth where nuclear fire had transformed sand and soil into twisted formations of radioactive crystal that gleamed with malevolent beauty under the desert sun. The journey required careful navigation through areas where radiation levels fluctuated wildly, creating invisible hazards that could prove as deadly as any raider or mutant creature. The Geiger counter that the Chosen One had acquired during their travels clicked with increasing frequency as they approached zones where atomic weapons had struck with particular intensity, creating lasting contamination that would persist for generations beyond the current struggle for survival in the wasteland. Wildlife in this region showed more extreme mutations than had been observed in areas closer to established settlements, suggesting that proximity to ground zero of nuclear strikes had accelerated evolutionary changes in ways that produced creatures bearing little resemblance to their pre-war ancestors. two-headed deer grazed on vegetation that glowed with its own bioluminescent light, while packs of wild dogs displayed coordination and intelligence that bordered on human-level reasoning capabilities. The isolation of this territory had also made it attractive to groups that preferred to conduct their activities away from the oversight of organized communities and their attempts to maintain basic standards of civilized behavior. Evidence of raider camps appeared with increasing frequency, circles of ash where cooking fires had burned, scattered bones that showed signs of being gnawed by human teeth, and crude markers that warned trespassers of territorial claims enforced through violence rather than negotiation. It was during the third day of travel through this increasingly hostile environment that the Chosen One encountered a scene that would haunt their dreams for weeks to come and fundamentally alter their understanding of the true scope of the threats facing all post-war survivors who valued freedom and dignity above mere existence. The confrontation unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare made manifest in waking reality. The family that the Chosen One spotted in the distance appeared to be traveling along the same general route, their movement patterns suggesting people who were familiar with the terrain but were attempting to maintain low visibility to avoid attracting unwanted attention from the various predatory groups that operated in the region. Their clothing and equipment marked them as settlers rather than raiders, people who had chosen to build rather than destroy despite the challenges that such choices involved in the post-war world. The three soldiers who had surrounded the family moved with the disciplined precision of professional military personnel, their equipment and bearing, suggesting training and resources far superior to those possessed by typical wasteland mercenaries or raider gangs. Their coordinated positioning and tactical awareness indicated experience in operations that required systematic application of overwhelming force against civilian populations who lacked the means to offer effective resistance. The largest of the soldiers was a figure whose physical presence dominated the landscape around him, like some primordial force of destruction given human form. His power armor had been modified and enhanced far beyond standard military specifications, transforming him into something that seemed more machine than man. When he spoke, his voice carried the mechanical amplification of sophisticated communication systems, but the words themselves revealed intelligence and calculation that made his capacity for violence all the more terrifying. The family's patriarch faced this overwhelming display of military superiority with the kind of quiet courage that characterized people who had chosen to maintain their principles despite living in a world where such choices often led to suffering and death. His refusal to comply with the soldiers' demands was delivered not with defiant bluster, but with the calm dignity of someone who understood the likely consequences of resistance, yet refused to compromise his fundamental values. The knowledge that the soldiers sought was clearly something that the family possessed but considered too dangerous or morally problematic to share with representatives of whatever organization had sent these men to retrieve it. The father's reference to his willingness to let such knowledge die with him, rather than see it fall into the wrong hands, suggested information that could have significant military or strategic applications if obtained by groups with hostile intentions. The negotiation that followed revealed the systematic approach to intimidation and coercion that characterized the soldiers' organization, with escalating threats designed to break down resistance through psychological pressure rather than immediate violence. The measured escalation from verbal warnings to implied consequences for family members demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the leverage that could be applied against people whose primary concern was protecting their loved ones. The family's continued refusal to cooperate, despite increasingly specific threats against their safety, revealed the depth of their conviction that whatever knowledge they possessed should not be shared with their captors under any circumstances. Their willingness to accept death rather than compromise their principles represented the kind of moral courage that had become increasingly rare in a world where survival often seemed to require abandoning ethical standards in favor of pragmatic accommodation with evil. The execution that followed was conducted with the same clinical efficiency that had characterized the entire encounter, transforming human beings into lifeless objects through the application of weapons technology that reduced the complexity of conscious existence to mere patterns of disrupted matter. The advanced energy weapons that the soldiers employed left no opportunity for heroic last stands or dramatic final words, simply erasing their targets from existence with mechanical precision. The warning that the massive soldier delivered to the Chosen One after completing his massacre carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate threat of personal violence. His casual reference to making examples of those who interfered with their operations suggested a systematic campaign of terror designed to eliminate resistance through demonstration of overwhelming superiority rather than negotiation or compromise. His organization clearly possessed resources and capabilities that made conventional military opposition futile, while maintaining enough operational security to conduct mass murder without fear of retaliation. The psychological impact of witnessing such casual brutality against innocent people created trauma that penetrated deep into the Chosen One's consciousness, challenging their fundamental assumptions about the nature of heroism and the possibility of meaningful resistance against overwhelming evil. The realization that such forces existed and operated with apparent impunity transformed their quest from a straightforward mission to save their village into something much more complex and dangerous. The soldiers' departure from the scene was conducted with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized their arrival and the subsequent massacre, leaving behind only scattered remains, and the lingering impression that this encounter represented merely one incident in a much larger pattern of systematic violence against civilian populations. Their casual indifference to potential witnesses suggested confidence that their organization possessed sufficient power to eliminate any threats that might emerge from exposure of their activities. The continued journey toward Vault 15 after this traumatic encounter proceeded through landscape that seemed to have been infected by the violence that the Chosen One had witnessed, with every shadow potentially concealing additional threats and every distant figure representing possible danger rather than opportunity for peaceful interaction. The psychological burden of carrying knowledge about the murdered family's fate created internal pressure that made concentration on practical survival tasks increasingly difficult. The approach to Vault 15 revealed a settlement that had grown up around the vault entrance, creating a community of people who had apparently succeeded in establishing some form of organized society, despite the dangers that characterized the surrounding region. The buildings showed evidence of careful planning and construction techniques that suggested access to pre-war knowledge and possibly even functional technology that had been preserved or recovered from the vault itself. But the presence of armed guards and defensive fortifications around the settlement's perimeter indicated awareness of external threats that required constant vigilance and preparedness for potential conflict. The weapons and equipment visible among the community's defenders suggested access to military-grade hardware that might have come from the vault or been acquired through trade relationships with other well-equipped groups. The guard posts that the Chosen One encountered while attempting to approach the settlement were manned by individuals whose appearance and behavior suggested refugees rather than professional soldiers, people who had been forced to take up arms out of necessity rather than inclination. Their nervousness and obvious inexperience with military procedures indicated recent trauma that had transformed peaceful settlers into reluctant warriors preparing for battles they hoped would never come. The conversation with guards who were willing to discuss their situation revealed a community under siege by forces that matched the description of the soldiers who had murdered the family in the desert. The mysterious organization that local residents referred to only in whispers had been conducting systematic raids against settlements throughout the region, seeking individuals who possessed specific types of knowledge or skills that served their unknown agenda. The refugees who had gathered around Vault 15 represented survivors from multiple communities that had been destroyed or abandoned due to pressure from these systematic attacks. Their stories created a pattern of coordinated violence that suggested military operations conducted according to strategic objectives rather than simple raiding for resources or territory. The targeting of educated individuals and technical specialists indicated an organization that valued knowledge and expertise above conventional forms of wealth or power. The vault itself remained sealed and apparently impenetrable despite the efforts of various groups to gain access to whatever resources or technology it might contain. The settlement's inhabitants had established their community in the area, partly out of hope that the vault might eventually be opened, and partly because the defensive advantages of the terrain made it easier to protect their population from external threats. Rebecca's story about her missing daughter provided a personal dimension to the larger pattern of violence and disappearance that had characterized recent events in the region. Her description of Chrissy as an adventurous child who enjoyed exploring areas that adults considered too dangerous suggested personality traits that might have led her into contact with hostile forces operating in the vicinity of the Port-Vassen settlement. The search for Chrissy led the Chosen One through areas around Vault 15 that showed clear evidence of recent military activity, with tracks and equipment debris indicating the presence of well-equipped forces that had been conducting operations in the immediate vicinity of the settlement. The systematic nature of these traces suggested surveillance and reconnaissance activities rather than random patrols or raiding expeditions. The discovery of the hidden entrance that had been used by unknown individuals to access areas near the vault revealed sophisticated operational security measures that confirmed the presence of organized groups with advanced capabilities and specific objectives related to the sealed facility. The camouflaged access point and the security measures protecting it indicated long-term planning and significant resource investment in whatever activities were being conducted. The infiltration of the hidden facility led the Chosen One into contact with members of the New Khans, a raider organization whose operations in the region had been carefully concealed from the legitimate settlement that had grown up around Vault 15. Their presence explained many of the mysterious activities and disappearances that had plagued the area, while revealing the true scope of the threat facing peaceful communities throughout the wasteland. The New Khan's leader, Darion, represented a figure whose personal history and political motivations created connections between current events and historical conflicts that stretched back to the earliest days of post-war civilization. His age and experience indicated participation in events that most contemporary survivors knew only through stories and legends, making him a living link to the formative period when the basic patterns of wasteland society were being established through violence and competition. Darion's obsession with revenge against Tandy and the new California Republic reflected the kind of generational hatred that could perpetuate cycles of violence across decades, transforming personal grievances into political movements that threatened entire regions with instability and destruction. His manipulation of the legitimate settlement's inhabitants demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to exploit people's desperation and need for security to advance his own agenda. The revelation that the New Khans had been using the settlement as cover for their operations while systematically betraying their supposed beneficiaries to external enemies created moral complexities that challenged simple distinctions between heroes and villains. The raiders' provision of supplies and protection had enabled the settlement's survival, Yet their ultimate intentions involved exploitation and potential destruction of the same people they claimed to be helping. The confrontation with Darion in the depths of Vault 15 provided the Chosen One with their first direct encounter with someone whose personal history connected them to legendary figures from wasteland history. Darion's role as the sole survivor of the massacre that had ended the original Khan's organization gave him both motivation for revenge and practical knowledge about the consequences of challenging more powerful adversaries without adequate preparation or resources. The battle that eliminated Darion and collapsed his organization's control over the region demonstrated how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire communities and political movements. The removal of his leadership caused the immediate disintegration of alliances and operational structures that had taken years to establish, creating power vacuums that would be filled by other groups with their own agendas and methods. The access to Vault 15's central computer that resulted from Darion's defeat provided the Chosen One with crucial information about other Vault locations, including the coordinates for the legendary Vault 13 that had been mentioned in Arroyo's most sacred stories. The discovery that this facility was located within reasonable traveling distance offered hope that their quest might finally be approaching its successful conclusion. The political agreements that the Chosen One negotiated between the settlement's inhabitants and the new California Republic created frameworks for regional stability that addressed the immediate security concerns that had made communities vulnerable to exploitation by groups like the new Khans. The integration of the settlement into the Republic's expanding territory provided access to resources and protection that could prevent future crises while maintaining local autonomy in matters that did not affect broader regional interests. The departure from Vault 15 carried with it the weight of decisions made and relationships formed during their time in the community, as well as the knowledge that their actions had fundamentally altered the political landscape of the entire region. The elimination of Darion's organization and the establishment of NCR protection had created new possibilities for peace and development, while also potentially generating new forms of conflict and competition. The journey toward Vault 13 would take the Chosen One through territories that remained largely unexplored and potentially dangerous, requiring careful planning and resource management to ensure safe arrival at their ultimate destination. The coordinates provided by Vault 15's computer were precise, but offered no information about current conditions at the target location or the challenges that might be encountered along the route. The psychological burden of carrying memories from the family's massacre and the moral complexities revealed through their encounter with Darion created internal tensions that would influence the Chosen One's approach to future challenges and decisions. The knowledge that powerful organizations operated throughout the wasteland, with agendas that threatened all forms of peaceful civilization, added urgency to their quest, while making success seem both more necessary and more difficult to achieve. As the Chosen One prepared to continue their journey toward what might finally prove to be the solution to Arroyo's crisis, they carried with them not just the practical knowledge and resources acquired through their recent experiences, but also a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped post-war political developments and the price that individuals and communities paid for attempting to maintain civilized values in an environment that often rewarded brutality and exploitation above all other considerations. The journey to Vault 13 carried the Chosen One across landscapes that seemed to whisper with the weight of legend and expectation, each mile traveled bringing them closer to the mythical birthplace of the Vault Dweller and the potential salvation of their dying village. The terrain itself appeared to recognize the significance of their destination, with rock formations and desert vistas that possessed an almost sacred quality, as if the very earth understood that this place had witnessed events that shaped the course of post-war civilization. The coordinates provided by Vault 15's database led through territories that showed clear evidence of having been traveled by others seeking the same legendary destination, with faint trails worn into the hard-pan desert floor by generations of pilgrims, treasure seekers, and desperate individuals who had heard stories about the miraculous technology that might still lie hidden within the vault's sealed chambers. Some of these earlier expeditions had clearly ended in failure, their remains scattered by wind and scavengers across the unforgiving landscape. The approach to Vault 13 revealed none of the settlement activity or defensive preparations that had characterized the areas around other vaults the Chosen One had visited. Instead, the massive door that sealed the legendary facility stood in pristine condition, its pre-war engineering having survived decades of exposure to desert conditions without showing signs of the wear and damage that had affected most contemporary structures. The absence of any visible attempt to breach the entrance suggested that whatever lay within had remained undisturbed since the vault's original sealing. But as the Chosen One drew closer to the entrance, subtle signs began to suggest that their assumptions about the vault's abandonment might be incorrect. Fresh tracks in the sand around the door indicated recent activity, while faint sounds from within the facility suggested the presence of inhabitants who had somehow gained access despite the apparently impenetrable barrier that had frustrated so many previous visitors. The discovery that the vault door could be opened through proper activation procedures rather than force created both relief and apprehension as the Chosen One realized that their quest might finally be approaching its conclusion. The massive portal responded to their approach with mechanical precision that demonstrated the superiority of pre-war engineering over contemporary technology, revealing corridors that had been maintained in functional condition despite decades of isolation from the outside world. The interior of Vault 13 exceeded even the Chosen One's elevated expectations for pre-war technology and social organization, with systems and infrastructure that functioned as smoothly as they had on the day of the Great War. Clean air circulated through perfectly climate-controlled chambers, while sophisticated lighting systems provided illumination that made the harsh desert sun seem dim by comparison. Everything spoke of a civilization whose capabilities had been almost incomprehensibly advanced, compared to the desperate improvisation that characterized most contemporary survival efforts. But the true surprise that awaited within the vault's chambers challenged every assumption that the Chosen One had made about what kinds of inhabitants they might encounter in this legendary facility. Instead of human vault dwellers or the empty corridors they had expected, they found themselves facing creatures whose appearance initially triggered every instinct for fight or flight response that evolution had programmed into human psychology. The intelligent Deathclaws that had made Vault 13 their home represented one of the most remarkable evolutionary developments in the post-war world, combining the physical capabilities that made their species the apex predator of most wasteland ecosystems, with cognitive abilities that rivaled or exceeded those of human intelligence. Their presence in the vault created immediate tension between the Chosen One's learned responses to Deathclaw encounters and the obvious evidence that these particular specimens possessed reasoning capabilities that demanded entirely different approaches to interaction. The first Deathclaw that the Chosen One encountered within the vault's corridors demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that distinguished this particular population from their feral cousins who roamed the wasteland as mindless, killing machines. Instead of attacking immediately upon detecting an intruder, the creature attempted communication, using crude but understandable vocalizations to express curiosity about the Chosen One's purpose and intentions rather than treating them as automatic prey. This initial contact led to a meeting with Gruthar, the pack's leader, whose intelligence and moral reasoning capabilities proved to be fully equivalent to those of the most sophisticated human leaders the Chosen One had encountered during their travels. Gruthar's ability to engage in complex negotiations and philosophical discussions while maintaining the dignity and authority necessary for effective leadership demonstrated that intelligence and wisdom were not exclusively human characteristics. The story that Gruthar shared about his pack's origins revealed connections to the same mysterious organization whose soldiers had murdered the family in the desert, creating links between apparently unrelated events that suggested vast coordinated operations stretching across the entire region. The revelation that these Deathclaws had been created as part of deliberate genetic engineering experiments rather than natural evolutionary processes added new dimensions to the Chosen One's understanding of the forces that were shaping post-war development. The massacre that had brought the Deathclaws to Vault 13 paralleled other incidents that the Chosen One had witnessed or heard about during their travels, creating patterns of systematic violence that indicated coordinated military operations rather than random acts of brutality. The targeting of Vault 13's human inhabitants for elimination while preserving the facility's infrastructure suggested strategic objectives that valued technology and resources over human life. The Deathclaws' account of their enslavement by the organization that had created them revealed the moral complexities that could arise when advanced technology was applied to biological manipulation without adequate consideration of ethical implications. Their rebellion against their creators represented not just a struggle for freedom, but a rejection of the fundamental premise that intelligence and consciousness could be treated as commodities to be owned and controlled by others. Gruthar's leadership of his pack's transformation from weapons of war into peaceful inhabitants of Vault 13 demonstrated the possibilities for positive change that could emerge when intelligence was combined with moral, reasoning, and genuine concern for community welfare. The social structures that the Deathclaws had developed reflected sophisticated understanding of cooperation and mutual support that many human communities failed to achieve, despite their supposedly superior civilization. The relationship that had developed between the Deathclaws and the few human survivors who had remained in the vault after the massacre created a unique, experimental community where traditional prejudices and fears had been overcome through shared experience and mutual respect. The cooperation between species that would normally be mortal enemies provided powerful evidence that peaceful coexistence was possible even between groups with fundamental biological differences. The crisis that currently threatened this experimental community centered on the malfunction of technological systems that the Deathclaws needed for survival, but lacked the technical knowledge to repair independently. The voice recognition systems that controlled access to food and water supplies had been damaged during the massacre, creating shortages that forced the pack to venture outside the vault in search of resources, exposing them to dangers and potential conflicts with human settlements. The repair of the mainframe computer that controlled these essential systems required components and expertise that the Chosen One could provide, creating an opportunity for mutual assistance that would benefit both their quest for the GECK and the Deathclaws' need for technological support. The successful completion of this task would demonstrate the kinds of positive outcomes that could result from cooperation between different post-war populations. The technical challenges involved in repairing the damaged computer systems provided the Chosen One with valuable experience in working with pre-war technology while highlighting the sophisticated infrastructure that had once supported vault populations in comfort and safety. The integration of multiple systems for life support, communication, and resource management reflected engineering capabilities that contemporary wasteland communities could barely comprehend. The successful restoration of the mainframe's functionality marked a turning point in the relationship between the Chosen One and the Deathclaw pack, transforming them from wary potential allies into genuine friends united by shared accomplishments and mutual respect. The celebration that followed the repair work demonstrated the emotional depth and social bonding capabilities that the Deathclaws possessed, despite their fearsome appearance. Gruthar's presentation of the Garden of Eden creation kit as payment for their assistance fulfilled the Chosen One's quest objective, while simultaneously validating the cooperative approach to problem-solving that had characterized their interaction with the Deathclaw community. The GECK itself was everything that the legends had promised. A technological marvel that could indeed transform barren wasteland into fertile paradise through applications of science that bordered on the miraculous. The examination of the GECK's components and operating procedures provided the Chosen One with understanding of how the device functioned and what would be required for its successful deployment in Arroyo. The sophisticated integration of terraforming technology, biological engineering, and resource management systems reflected the pinnacle of pre-war scientific achievement, representing humanity's most optimistic vision of its ability to heal environmental damage and create sustainable communities. But the true value of the Chosen One's time in Vault 13 extended beyond the acquisition of the GECK to encompass the relationships formed and the lessons learned about the possibilities for peaceful coexistence between different forms of post-war life. The friendship with Gruthar and his pack provided proof that intelligence and moral reasoning could emerge in unexpected forms while maintaining essential characteristics of consciousness and dignity. Goris, Gruthar's scholarly son, represented the next generation of Deathclaw development, combining inherited intelligence with educational opportunities that had been denied to previous generations. His interest in comparative anthropology and cultural studies demonstrated intellectual curiosity that rivaled that of pre-war academics, while providing insights into how different post-war communities had adapted to their pre-war academics. Challenging circumstances. The decision by Goris to accompany the Chosen One on their continuing journey represented both personal adventure and scientific opportunity, allowing him to conduct field research into human society, while providing the Chosen One with a companion whose unique perspective and capabilities would prove invaluable for future challenges. Their friendship bridged species differences while creating bonds based on shared interests and mutual respect. The departure from Vault 13 was complicated by the knowledge that this remarkable community remained vulnerable to external threats that could destroy everything they had built together. The organization that had conducted the original massacre was still operating throughout the region, and their systematic targeting of unusual populations suggested that the Deathclaws would continue to face dangers until these forces were eliminated or neutralized. The promise that the Chosen One made to return if their assistance was needed created ongoing obligations that extended beyond their immediate quest to save Arroyo. The relationships formed in Vault 13 had transformed their understanding of heroism from individual achievement to community service, emphasizing the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves, rather than simply accumulating personal glory or power. The journey away from Vault 13 with the precious GECK finally in their possession marked the beginning of what should have been a triumphant return to Arroyo and the successful conclusion of their quest. The device that could save their dying village was real, functional, and within their control, representing the fulfillment of every hope that had motivated their departure from home weeks earlier. But the euphoria of success was tempered by growing awareness of the larger threats that continued to menace all post-war communities, including their own village. The mysterious organization whose activities had been glimpsed throughout their journey represented dangers that extended far beyond individual settlements to encompass systematic threats to anyone who valued freedom and peaceful development over subjugation and exploitation. The companions who now traveled with the Chosen One, Goris the scholarly Deathclaw, Marcus the philosophical supermutant, and others who had joined their cause, represented a coalition of individuals whose diverse backgrounds and capabilities provided both practical advantages and symbolic significance. Their cooperation demonstrated that the future of post-war civilization might depend on collaboration between different types of survivors, rather than domination by any single group. The return journey toward Arroyo proceeded through landscapes that seemed somehow different from those the Chosen One had traveled during their outward journey, transformed by their expanded understanding of the political and social forces that shaped wasteland life. Every settlement and landmark now carried associations with the broader patterns of conflict and cooperation that determined whether communities would survive or perish. The vision messages that began to interrupt their dreams as they drew closer to home carried urgency and desperation that suggested something had gone terribly wrong in Arroyo during their absence. The Elder's voice reached across the wasteland through connections that transcended normal physical limitations, carrying warnings about imminent catastrophe and pleas for immediate assistance. The increasing frequency and intensity of these psychic communications created growing anxiety about what they might find upon their return home, transforming what should have been a celebration of successful completion of their quest into a desperate race against time to prevent disaster. The GECK that had seemed like the ultimate solution to their village's problems might prove to be insufficient if the community no longer existed to benefit from its miraculous capabilities. As the Chosen One pushed forward through the final stages of their journey toward Arroyo, they carried with them not only the technological salvation their people needed, but also the knowledge and relationships that had been forged through months of travel and adventure in the post-war world. The person returning home was fundamentally different from the one who had departed, transformed by experiences that had revealed both the worst and best aspects of human nature, while demonstrating the possibilities for positive change even in the harshest circumstances. The stage was set for revelations that would transform their understanding of the true scope of the threats facing their village and all other peaceful communities throughout the wasteland, leading to confrontations with evil that would test everything they had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the price of protecting innocence in a world where such protection required constant vigilance and unlimited dedication to principles that transcended individual survival. The final approach to Arroyo carried the Chosen One across familiar territories that should have provided comfort and reassurance after months of traveling through dangerous and unknown lands. Yet the landscape itself seemed to whisper warnings of catastrophe that made each step forward an act of courage rather than homecoming celebration. The desert air that had once carried the sense of home cooking fires and fertile gardens now bore traces of smoke and destruction that transformed anticipation into growing dread with every mile traveled. The dream visions that had begun as gentle communications from the village elder had evolved into desperate psychic screams that penetrated the Chosen One's consciousness with increasing intensity and urgency. These were not the measured spiritual guidance that had characterized previous mystical contacts, but raw emotional transmissions that carried terror, desperation, and the kind of overwhelming grief that comes from witnessing the destruction of everything that gives life meaning and purpose. The words that reached the Chosen One through these supernatural channels spoke of dark souls and great dragonflies that spat flame, of evil men who crawled from mechanical bellies and brought death to warriors whose courage could not overcome technological superiority. The imagery was both specific and surreal, describing events that challenged normal understanding while conveying the unmistakable reality of systematic violence conducted with overwhelming force against defenseless people. The reference to warriors whose spearheads proved weak against the lights of hell suggested that Arroyo's defenders had fought bravely but had been overwhelmed by weapons technology that rendered traditional combat skills obsolete. The phrase carried both pride in their courage and sorrow for their inevitable defeat, acknowledging heroism while recognizing the futility of resistance against forces that possessed such overwhelming advantages in equipment and coordination. The mention of strange mist that stole minds and sent victims to the land of sleep painted a picture of chemical warfare that transformed conscious resistance into helpless vulnerability, allowing attackers to collect their targets like livestock rather than engaging in honest combat. This detail suggested systematic planning and specialized equipment designed specifically for mass capture rather than simple destruction, indicating objectives that required living prisoners rather than corpses. The revelation that the attackers had taken everyone rather than simply killing them provided both hope and additional horror, suggesting that the people of Arroyo might still be alive but faced fates that could prove worse than death. The systematic nature of the kidnapping operation indicated planning and resources that pointed toward organized military action rather than random raiding, while the preservation of captives suggested purposes that required living subjects for unknown experiments or exploitation. Hakunin's spirit had returned to his burned and broken body, specifically to deliver crucial intelligence about the attackers' immediate plans and movements, demonstrating the kind of dedication to community welfare that characterized the shamanic traditions that had guided Arroyo since its founding. His sacrifice in clinging to life long enough to provide actionable information represented the final service of someone who had devoted his existence to protecting and nurturing his people through spiritual guidance and herbal wisdom. The intelligence that Hakunin provided about Navarro as a temporary staging area where the great mechanical beasts would rest before crossing the ocean created the first concrete opportunity for rescue operations since the Chosen One had discovered the village's destruction. This information suggested that the attackers were not local raiders, but representatives of some distant power that possessed sufficient resources to conduct intercontinental operations using advanced transportation technology. The reference to crossing the Great Basin of Earth Mother's Tears indicated movement toward the Pacific Ocean, suggesting that the ultimate destination lay somewhere beyond the western horizon, where no known settlements or organizations possessed the capabilities necessary to support such sophisticated military operations. This detail pointed toward remnants of pre-war civilization that had somehow survived the nuclear apocalypse while maintaining technological superiority over all other post-war communities. The final approach to Arroyo revealed devastation that exceeded even the Chosen One's worst fears, with smoke rising from structures that had been reduced to smoldering ruins by weapons that had turned stone and adobe into twisted wreckage. The systematic nature of the destruction indicated deliberate demolition rather than collateral damage from military operations, suggesting that the attackers had possessed both time and motivation to ensure that nothing useful would remain for potential survivors or rescue efforts. The bodies of fallen warriors lay scattered throughout the village in positions that told stories of desperate final stands against overwhelming odds. Their traditional weapons and improvised defenses proving utterly inadequate against the advanced technology that had been deployed against them. The burn patterns on their remains indicated energy weapons that had killed through thermal damage, rather than conventional ballistics, confirming the supernatural descriptions that Hakunin's spirit had provided. The absence of civilian casualties among the visible dead reinforced the intelligence about systematic capture operations designed to take prisoners rather than eliminate the population entirely. The The attackers had clearly distinguished between combatants who required elimination and non-combatants who possessed value as captives, demonstrating tactical sophistication that indicated professional military training rather than simple raider brutality. The discovery of Hakunin's burned and broken body in the ruins of his healing lodge provided heartbreaking confirmation of both the shaman's sacrifice and the accuracy of the spiritual communications that had guided the Chosen One during their final approach to the destroyed village. His physical form showed evidence of having survived the initial attack long enough to witness its aftermath, gathering crucial intelligence about the attackers' plans, before allowing his spirit to seek out their distant champion. The conversation with Hakunin's lingering spirit provided additional details about the attack that helped the Chosen One understand both the scope of the threat they faced and the urgency of mounting rescue operations before the first captives could be transported beyond reach. The mechanical dragonflies that had dominated the assault were clearly aircraft of some kind, representing technology that no known wasteland community possessed, and suggesting military capabilities that had somehow survived the Great War intact. The description of flame weapons that had overwhelmed Arroyo's defenders indicated specialized military hardware designed for crowd control and area denial, rather than simple destruction, confirming that the attackers had planned their operation to minimize damage to valuable infrastructure while ensuring complete suppression of resistance. This tactical approach suggested objectives that extended beyond simple raiding to encompass long-term occupation or resource extraction. The strange mist that had rendered the population helpless appeared to be some form of chemical agent that induced unconsciousness without causing permanent harm, allowing for efficient mass capture without the complications that would arise from dealing with injured or traumatized prisoners. This capability pointed towards sophisticated chemical warfare technology that few post-war organizations could develop or deploy effectively. The intelligence about the attackers' movements toward Navarro provided the Chosen One with actionable information that could guide rescue efforts, but the time frame involved suggested that immediate action would be required to intercept the captives before they could be transported to their ultimate destination. The reference to crossing an ocean of tears indicated intercontinental movement that would place the prisoners beyond any hope of rescue once it was completed. The emotional impact of witnessing their home's destruction and learning about their people's fate created psychological trauma that threatened to overwhelm the Chosen One's ability to function rationally and plan effective responses to the crisis. The combination of grief, rage, and desperate hope created internal conflicts that required conscious effort to manage while maintaining focus on practical steps that might still lead to successful rescue operations. The GECK that had represented salvation for Arroyo's environmental crisis now seemed almost mockingly irrelevant in the face of human catastrophe that had eliminated the community it was meant to save. The technological miracle that could transform barren wasteland into fertile paradise had no power to restore life to the dead or freedom to the enslaved, highlighting the limitations of even the most advanced tools when confronted with evil that operated through systematic violence and exploitation. The companions who had traveled with the Chosen One during their quest shared in the emotional burden of discovering that their successful completion of the original mission had come too late to prevent the very disaster it was meant to avert. Their presence provided both practical support for whatever actions might still be possible and emotional comfort during a period of grief and shock that could easily have proven overwhelming for someone facing such devastation alone. The decision to pursue the attackers to Navarro represented a fundamental shift in the Chosen One's mission from environmental restoration to military rescue operation, requiring different skills and resources while accepting risks that could prove fatal for both rescuer and captives. The transformation from peaceful quest to to violent confrontation reflected the harsh realities of post-war life, where good intentions and technological solutions meant nothing without the power to protect them against predatory forces. The journey toward Navarro would take the Chosen One through territories that had been traversed by the attacking force, providing opportunities to gather additional intelligence about their capabilities and intentions while following a trail of destruction that marked their passage through the wasteland. The systematic nature of the damage they had inflicted along their route suggested ongoing military operations rather than a single isolated raid against Arroyo. The evidence of other communities that had suffered similar attacks created a pattern of coordinated violence that indicated regional or even continental operations designed to eliminate or capture specific populations according to criteria that remained mysterious but clearly followed consistent, strategic objectives. The scope of these operations suggested resources and organizational capabilities that exceeded those of any known post-war faction. The growing understanding that Arroyo's destruction was part of a much larger campaign of systematic violence against wasteland communities created both despair about the magnitude of the threat and determination to resist forces that represented existential dangers to all forms of peaceful civilization. The personal stakes involved in rescuing captured family and friends were now balanced by broader moral obligations to confront evil that threatened everyone who valued freedom and dignity. The psychological preparation for what might prove to be a suicide mission to rescue the captives required the Chosen One to confront their own mortality while maintaining hope that success was still possible despite overwhelming odds. The knowledge that failure would mean not just personal death but the permanent enslavement or worse of everyone they had sworn to protect created pressure that tested the limits of human endurance and resolve. The approach to Navarro would bring the Chosen One into direct confrontation with the mysterious organization that had destroyed their world, providing the first opportunity to gather concrete intelligence about their true nature and capabilities, while attempting to mount rescue operations that could theoretically succeed, but would more likely result in the deaths of both rescuer and captives. The stage was set for the most dangerous phase of their journey, where all previous adventures would prove to have been mere preparation for ultimate tests of courage and sacrifice. As the Chosen One prepared to leave the ruins of Arroyo behind and pursue their enemies to whatever fate awaited at Navarro, they carried with them not just the practical equipment and allies needed for military operations, but also the emotional burden of having failed to prevent the very catastrophe their quest was meant to avert. The person who had departed months earlier as a hopeful young champion now returned as someone who understood that heroism often meant choosing between different forms of failure while accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond individual actions. The road to Navarro stretched ahead through landscapes that would test every skill and lesson acquired during their journey through the post-war world, leading toward confrontations that would determine not just the fate of Arroyo's captives, but the broader struggle between freedom and oppression that defined the moral landscape of their transformed civilization. The final chapters of their story would be written in whatever actions they chose to take when faced with evil that possessed overwhelming advantages in every conventional measure of power and capability. The journey from the ashes of Arroyo to the Pacific coastline carried the Chosen One through landscapes that bore increasing evidence of the mysterious organization's presence and activities, with each mile revealing new signs of the systematic operations that had been conducted throughout the region under cover of secrecy and technological superiority. The trail left by the massive aircraft that had transported Arroyo's captives was not visible in any conventional sense, Yet the subtle indicators of their passage could be read by those who understood how to interpret the clues left by advanced military movements. The coastline. When it finally came into view after days of relentless travel, presented vistas of terrible beauty where the Pacific Ocean met the transformed shores of post-war California. The water itself showed signs of contamination that created unnatural colors and textures, while the beaches were littered with debris from the old world that had been washing ashore for decades since the Great War ended. The civilization that had once dominated these waters with commerce and naval power, San Francisco emerged from the coastal haze like a monument to both human achievement and human folly, its remaining structures rising from the bay waters, in configurations that defied easy categorization as either ruins or functional installations. The city had clearly survived the nuclear exchange that had destroyed so many other population centers, though the evidence of damage and adaptation was visible everywhere in the form of improvised repairs, defensive modifications, and the general atmosphere of a community that had learned to thrive despite living amid the wreckage of a greater civilization. The political landscape of San Francisco proved to be even more complex than its physical configuration, with multiple factions competing for influence and control over resources that included not just the tangible assets of pre-war infrastructure, but also the intangible advantages of knowledge, technology, and strategic position. The Chosen One's arrival in this environment of shifting alliances and competing interests created both opportunities and dangers that would require careful navigation to avoid becoming entangled in conflicts that could delay or prevent their rescue mission. The Shi represented one of the most sophisticated post-war communities that the Chosen One had encountered, with technological capabilities and social organization that rivaled those of Vault City while maintaining cultural traditions that had somehow survived the apocalypse intact. Their integration of pre-war scientific knowledge with philosophical principles created a unique approach to post-war development that emphasized harmony between human needs and environmental limitations. The emperor that governed Shi society was revealed to be not a human ruler, but a sophisticated computer system that had achieved something approaching artificial consciousness through decades of accumulated data processing and analysis. This discovery challenged the Chosen One's understanding of intelligence and leadership, while providing access to information resources that no purely human organization could have maintained or developed independently. The Brotherhood of Steel's presence in San Francisco represented a different approach to preserving and utilizing pre-war technology, with their quasi-religious devotion to hoarding advanced equipment creating both impressive capabilities and dangerous limitations. Their military organization and technological expertise made them potentially valuable allies for operations against advanced enemies, yet their secretive nature and rigid hierarchy created barriers to cooperation that could prove difficult to overcome. The Hubologists provided a third perspective on post-war survival and development, combining elements of pre-war religious movements with adaptations to post-apocalyptic conditions that had created a belief system focused on transcending earthly limitations through spiritual and technological advancement. Their obsession with space travel and cosmic consciousness reflected both admirable ambition and potentially dangerous detachment from immediate practical concerns. The competition between these factions for influence and resources created a complex political environment where the Chosen One's actions and alliances would have far-reaching consequences, extending well beyond their immediate objective of rescuing Arroyo's captives. The choice of which group to support or work with would determine not just the success of their mission, but the future balance of power in one of the most strategically important locations on the post-war continent. The Shi Emperor's analysis of Enclave activities provided the first concrete intelligence about the true nature and scope of the organization that had destroyed Arroyo and kidnapped its population. The revelation that this group possessed sufficient resources and technology to maintain a major military installation on an offshore oil rig suggested capabilities that exceeded those of any known post-war faction by orders of magnitude. The naval computers monitoring of Enclave movements had produced detailed intelligence about their transportation patterns, communication frequencies, and operational procedures that could prove invaluable for planning, infiltration, or assault operations. The 97% probability assessment that Arroyo's captives had been transported to the oil rig installation provided the first definitive target for rescue efforts, while confirming the enormous challenges that such an operation would face. The distance to the Enclave's offshore facility and the technological barriers protecting it created logistical problems that seemed almost insurmountable, given the resources available to the Chosen One and their allies. The Pacific Ocean represented a barrier that no wasteland community had successfully crossed since the Great War, while the Enclave's defensive capabilities suggested that conventional assault methods would prove suicidal for anyone attempting to reach their installation. The search for transportation to the oil rig led the Chosen One through San Francisco's complex web of competing interests and hidden agendas, with each potential solution requiring navigation of political relationships that could easily become more dangerous than the primary mission itself. The various factions' willingness to assist depended on their assessment of how the Chosen One's success or failure would affect their own long-term objectives and survival prospects. The discovery of the PMV Valdez represented a breakthrough in solving the transportation problem, though the massive oil tanker's current condition and the requirements for making it operational created new sets of challenges that would require significant resources and expertise to overcome. The ship itself was a marvel of pre-war engineering that had somehow survived the nuclear exchange, yet its systems needed substantial repair and modification to serve as a platform for military operations against heavily defended targets. Captain Aaron Myers proved to be one of the most crucial allies that the Chosen One encountered during their entire quest, combining intimate knowledge of Enclave operations with genuine commitment to opposing their systematic oppression of wasteland populations. His background as a deserter from Navarro provided invaluable intelligence about enemy capabilities and procedures, while his nautical expertise made the ocean crossing technically feasible despite the enormous risks involved. Myers' motivations for joining the mission extended beyond simple revenge or personal redemption to encompass genuine understanding that the Enclave's activities represented existential threats to all forms of independent civilization in the post-war world. His analysis of their long-term objectives suggested systematic campaigns designed to eliminate or enslave every population that had achieved any measure of success in rebuilding society from the ruins of the old world. The preparation of the Valdez for its dangerous mission required gathering specialized equipment and expertise from multiple sources throughout San Francisco, creating a complex web of obligations and relationships that demonstrated how individual actions could have far-reaching consequences for entire communities. The IFF transponder that would allow the ship to approach Enclave installations without triggering immediate defensive responses had been acquired during the Chosen One's infiltration of Navarro, while the navigation components needed for ocean travel had been obtained through their diplomatic success with the intelligent Deathclaws. The fuel requirements for the massive vessel created additional challenges that could only be resolved through cooperation with one of San Francisco's competing factions, forcing the Chosen One to choose allies while potentially creating enemies whose opposition could prove dangerous both during and after the mission. The political implications of these choices extended far beyond immediate operational needs to encompass long-term consequences for regional stability and development. The technical complexities of preparing an automated oil tanker for combat operations against heavily defended targets required expertise that spanned multiple disciplines from computer programming and mechanical engineering to tactical, planning, and psychological warfare. The integration of these different capabilities into a coherent operational plan demonstrated the kind of coordination and resource management that had once characterized major military operations, but had largely disappeared from the Mezer post-war world. The companions who chose to accompany the Chosen One on what everyone understood might prove to be a suicide mission represented diverse backgrounds and motivations that reflected the broader coalition of interests opposed to Enclave operations. Marcus brought philosophical wisdom and combat experience gained through decades of post-war survival, while Goris contributed scientific knowledge and unique perspectives on interspecies cooperation that could prove valuable for understanding enemy capabilities and limitations. The journey across the Pacific Ocean aboard the automated Valdez provided opportunities for final preparations and contemplation of the enormous challenges that awaited at their destination, while also serving as a point of no return that committed everyone aboard to seeing the mission through regardless of personal costs. The vast expanse of contaminated water that surrounded them served as both barrier and metaphor for the isolation that separated the Enclave's offshore installation from any potential sources of assistance or reinforcement. The ocean itself bore signs of the nuclear devastation that had transformed the entire planet, with areas of discoloration and unusual marine life that reflected the ongoing effects of atomic contamination on global ecosystems. The sight of mutated sea creatures and radioactive debris floating in the waters served as constant reminders of the Great War's consequences, while highlighting the artificial nature of the Enclave's claim to represent legitimate governmental authority over territories they had helped to devastate. The approach to Control Station Enclave revealed an installation that exceeded even the Chosen One's expectations for pre-war military technology and engineering capabilities, with defensive systems and infrastructure that demonstrated access to resources and knowledge that had somehow been preserved intact through decades of post-war chaos. The oil rig's transformation from civilian energy facility to military command center represented an achievement in engineering and organization that no contemporary wasteland community could hope to match or replicate. The external appearance of the installation suggested capabilities that extended far beyond simple defensive fortification to encompass research facilities, manufacturing capabilities, and communication systems that could coordinate operations across continental distances. The sight of advanced aircraft and sophisticated sensor arrays confirmed intelligence reports about Enclave technological superiority, while highlighting the enormous risks involved in attempting to infiltrate or assault such a heavily defended position. The infiltration plan that had been developed during the ocean crossing relied heavily on the Chosen One's ability to maintain their disguise as an Enclave operative while gathering intelligence about the location and condition of Arroyo's captives. The power, armor, and identification documents acquired during previous operations would provide the foundation for this deception, though success would depend on avoiding close scrutiny by personnel who might recognize inconsistencies in their cover story. The moment of actually boarding the oil rig represented the culmination of months of preparation and planning, yet also the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, where discovery would mean not just personal death, but the failure of any hope for rescuing the captives whose welfare had motivated the entire quest. The technological sophistication of the installation's security systems created constant awareness that exposure could come at any moment through electronic surveillance or automated identification procedures. The interior of Control Station Enclave revealed a functioning pre-war military installation that had been continuously maintained and upgraded throughout the decades since the Great War, creating an environment that seemed almost surreal in its contrast to the improvised settlements and jury-rigged technology that characterized most post-war communities. The clean corridors, advanced computer systems, and sophisticated life support infrastructure represented achievements that contemporary wasteland societies could barely imagine. The personnel who populated the installation moved with the confidence and efficiency that characterized professional military organizations, their equipment and bearing reflecting training and resources that had been maintained to pre-war standards despite the collapse of the civilization that had originally created them. Their casual discussions of operations and objectives provided glimpses into organizational culture and strategic thinking that helped explain both their capabilities and their ultimate vulnerabilities. The search for Arroyo's captives led through areas of the installation that revealed different aspects of Enclave operations, from research facilities where scientists conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of ethical behavior to detention areas where prisoners were held under conditions that reduced human beings to laboratory specimens. The systematic nature of these activities suggested long-term programs designed to serve objectives that extended far beyond immediate military needs. The discovery of the captives themselves provided both relief at confirming their survival and horror at witnessing the conditions under which they had been confined, and the experiments that had been conducted upon them. The energy barriers that contained them represented technology that was beyond the capability of any wasteland community to overcome, while the medical equipment surrounding their confinement areas suggested that their value to their captors lay in their utility as research subjects rather than simple prisoners of war. The reunion with the village elder and other familiar faces from Arroyo created emotional moments that had to be carefully controlled to avoid compromising operational security while providing the intelligence needed to understand the full scope of Enclave activities and the urgency of mounting rescue operations. The information that the captives shared about their treatment and the conversations they had overheard painted a picture of systematic genocide disguised as scientific research. The revelation that the Enclave's ultimate objective involved the complete elimination of all post-war human populations except their own organization transformed the Chosen One's rescue mission into something far more significant, a desperate attempt to prevent apocalyptic genocide that would make the original Great War seem limited by comparison. The scope of evil that they had uncovered exceeded anything they had imagined possible, while highlighting the terrible consequences that would follow if their mission failed. As the Chosen One prepared to move deeper into the installation in search of ways to free the captives and prevent the implementation of genocidal plans, they carried with them the knowledge that their actions would determine not just the fate of their own people, but the survival of human civilization itself, in forms that valued freedom and dignity over systematic oppression and exploitation. The deeper levels of Control Station Enclave revealed the true scope of the installation's capabilities and the horrifying nature of the research programs that had been conducted within its sealed chambers for decades since the Great War's end. The corridors that led away from the detention areas were lined with laboratories and research facilities that represented the pinnacle of pre-war scientific achievement. Yet their current applications had transformed instruments of healing and knowledge into tools of systematic oppression and genocide. The maze-like security system that protected the installation's most sensitive areas demonstrated the paranoid mentality that characterized Enclave leadership, with randomly shifting barriers and access controls designed to confuse and delay intruders, while providing multiple opportunities for detection and elimination. The 3x3 grid of chambers that the Chosen One encountered required patience and systematic exploration to navigate, with each wrong turn potentially leading to dead ends or security alerts that could compromise the entire mission. The break room that the Chosen One discovered during their exploration provided glimpses into the daily lives and casual conversations of personnel who had been raised to view genocide as routine administrative policy rather than the ultimate crime against humanity. Their discussions of operational procedures and research objectives revealed the systematic dehumanization that allowed ordinary individuals to participate in activities that would have horrified their pre-war ancestors. The storage room adjacent to the maze contained a second Garden of Eden creation kit that had been taken from Vault 13 during the massacre that had brought the intelligent Deathclaws to their underground refuge. This discovery confirmed the systematic nature of Enclave operations while providing potential backup resources that could prove crucial for Arroyo's reconstruction if the primary GECK was lost or damaged during the rescue. Operation. The office complex that occupied the installation's middle levels bustled with administrative personnel whose routine activities supported the massive logistical requirements of coordinating genocidal operations across continental distances. Their casual efficiency in processing orders for mass murder and systematic oppression demonstrated how bureaucratic structures could normalize evil through division of labor and emotional detachment from ultimate consequences. The accidental encounter with Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Charles Curling transformed the Chosen One's understanding of Enclave operations from abstract knowledge into personal confrontation with the intellectual frameworks that had been developed to justify systematic extermination of entire populations. Curling's academic demeanor and scientific credentials made his casual discussion of genocide all the more chilling, revealing how educational achievement and professional expertise could be perverted to serve the most evil purposes imaginable. Curling's explanation of his research methodology revealed the pseudoscientific rationales that had been constructed to provide intellectual cover for predetermined conclusions about the necessity of eliminating all post-war human populations. His characterization of radiation-induced genetic changes as proof of fundamental species differences reflected the kind of biological determinism that had historically been used to justify the worst atrocities committed by civilized societies. The forced evolutionary virus that represented the centerpiece of Enclave genocidal planning was described by its creator with the same clinical detachment that other scientists might have used to discuss improvements in crop yields or manufacturing efficiency. Curling's pride in his technical achievements was completely divorced from moral consideration of the human consequences that would result from the virus's deployment, demonstrating how scientific training could be corrupted when separated from ethical frameworks that recognize the fundamental value of conscious life. The global distribution system that had been developed for delivering the virus demonstrated engineering capabilities that rivaled the most ambitious pre-war projects, with atmospheric release mechanisms designed to ensure complete coverage of all inhabited areas within weeks of initial deployment. The systematic nature of this genocidal infrastructure revealed planning and resource investment that had consumed decades of effort, while highlighting the Enclave's absolute commitment to eliminating all competition for control over post-war reconstruction. The philosophical debate that developed between the Chosen One and Dr. Curling over the nature of humanity and evolution represented a confrontation between fundamentally different worldviews about the meaning of consciousness and the value of diversity in human development. The Chosen One's arguments about adaptation and survival challenged Curling's static conception of genetic purity, while highlighting the essential humanity that connected all post-war populations, regardless of their physical appearances or cultural adaptations. The reference to Darwin's theories of evolution and natural selection provided intellectual ammunition for countering Curling's pseudo-scientific claims about genetic superiority. demonstrating that genuine scientific understanding supported diversity and adaptation rather than the artificial homogeneity that Enclave ideology demanded. The comparison between Brahmin and pre-war cattle illustrated how successful adaptation could preserve essential characteristics while allowing for beneficial changes that improved survival prospects. Curling's gradual recognition of the flaws in his reasoning represented one of the most remarkable psychological transformations that the Chosen One had witnessed during their entire journey. As a man whose intellectual achievements had been perverted to serve evil, gradually rediscovered the moral principles that should have guided his scientific work from the beginning. His willingness to sacrifice his life to prevent the implementation of his own genocidal research demonstrated the possibility of redemption even for those who had contributed to systematic evil. The plan that Curling developed for turning the Enclave's own biological weapons against their creators represented poetic justice on a scale that matched the scope of the evil that had been intended, with the virus that was designed to eliminate all post-war populations, instead destroying those who had created it, while sparing their intended victims. The technical elegance of this solution reflected both Curling's scientific expertise and his newfound moral clarity about which populations deserved to survive. The antidote that Curling administered to the Chosen One provided protection that would allow them to survive the viral release, while highlighting the personal risks that the Doctor was accepting by implementing his plan for preventing genocide. His sacrifice represented both atonement for past sins and commitment to principles that transcended personal survival, demonstrating the kind of moral courage that defined true heroism. The recitation of William Blake's poem that accompanied Curling's death created a moment of profound spiritual significance that transformed the clinical environment of the laboratory into something approaching a sacred space, where questions about divine justice and moral responsibility were given their proper weight. The words about God's intentions in creating both tigers and lambs reflected the complex theological questions raised by the existence of both good and evil in conscious beings. The silence that followed Curling's death and the viral release created an atmosphere of eerie calm that marked the transformation of the installation from a bustling center of genocidal planning into a tomb that contained the remains of those who had devoted their lives to systematic oppression. The Chosen One's solitary movement through corridors, now filled with corpses, provided opportunities for reflection on the terrible justice that had been achieved through the sacrifice of someone who had chosen redemption over continued participation in evil. The dynamite that the Chosen One retrieved from the bodies of dead Enclave personnel represented the tools needed for completing the destruction of the installation's infrastructure while ensuring that its research facilities and genocidal technologies could never be recovered or reconstructed by surviving organizations with similar objectives. The explosive devices that had once been intended for offensive military operations would instead serve to eliminate the institutional foundations of systematic evil. The reactor level that housed the installation's power generation systems represented the heart of the technological infrastructure that had enabled decades of genocidal planning and research, with sophisticated atomic energy systems that had provided the electrical power needed for advanced laboratories and manufacturing facilities. The destruction of these systems would ensure that even if some personnel survived the viral attack, they would lack the resources needed to continue their operations. The computer terminal that controlled reactor operations proved resistant to normal shutdown procedures, forcing the Chosen One to resort to explosive demolition that would trigger catastrophic failure of the entire power generation system. The timer that appeared on the remaining functional screens provided clear warning that the installation's destruction was now inevitable, creating urgent pressure to complete rescue operations before the facility's complete collapse. The elevator system that provided access between different levels of the installation continued to function despite the viral attack and increasing structural damage, allowing the Chosen One to return to the detention areas where Arroyo's captives awaited rescue. The mechanical reliability of pre-war engineering was demonstrated by the continued operation of essential systems, even as the human operators who had maintained them lay dead throughout the facility. The force field generators that had confined the prisoners proved vulnerable to the same explosive techniques that had been used to destroy the reactor systems, with careful placement of dynamite charges, creating sufficient damage to disable the energy barriers without endangering the captives they had been designed to contain. The liberation of the detention areas marked the successful completion of the rescue mission's primary objective, while highlighting the urgent need for immediate evacuation. The reunion between the Chosen One and the village elder provided emotional validation for the sacrifices that had been made throughout the long quest, yet was tempered by awareness that survival was not yet guaranteed, and that the installation's destruction would create new dangers that required immediate attention. The elder's condition, and that of the other captives, reflected the physical and psychological trauma that had resulted from their imprisonment and the medical experiments that had been conducted upon them. The information that the captives shared about the layout of the installation and the location of escape routes proved invaluable for planning evacuation procedures that would get everyone to safety before the reactor's meltdown could trap them in the collapsing structure. Their knowledge of guard routines and security procedures had been gained through weeks of careful observation during their confinement, demonstrating the intelligence-gathering capabilities that had enabled their survival despite impossible circumstances. The path to the installation's exit led through areas that were now littered with the corpses of Enclave personnel who had succumbed to the viral attack, creating both navigational obstacles and powerful symbolic reminders of the justice that had been achieved through Dr. Curling's sacrifice. The sight of genocidal planners who had been destroyed by their own weapons provided grim satisfaction while highlighting the moral principles that distinguished heroes from villains. The entrance hall that provided access to the installation's exterior had been transformed into a makeshift staging area where surviving Enclave forces were making desperate preparations for final defensive actions, with the knowledge that their organization's genocidal plans had been thwarted and their leadership eliminated. The presence of these remaining personnel created final obstacles that would need to be overcome before successful evacuation could be completed. Sergeant Granite and his men represented the last organized resistance that stood between the Chosen One and successful completion of their rescue mission. Yet their demoralization and growing awareness of their situation created opportunities for negotiation rather than violent confrontation. Their willingness to consider alternatives to certain death reflected the human capacity for rational decision-making even in the most desperate circumstances. The countdown timer that marked the final minutes before reactor meltdown created urgency that affected everyone in the entrance hall regardless of their previous allegiances or commitments, transforming ideological conflicts into shared survival challenges that required cooperation rather than continued hostility. The approaching destruction of the installation created common interests that transcended political differences, while highlighting the futility of continuing previous conflicts. Frank Horrigan's appearance in the entrance hall represented the final and most dangerous obstacle that stood between the Chosen One and successful evacuation of the rescued captives. With his enhanced capabilities and absolute commitment to Enclave ideology, making him impervious to the rational arguments that had convinced other personnel to abandon their posts. His presence transformed what should have been routine evacuation procedures into a climactic battle that would determine whether anyone would survive to benefit from the sacrifices that had already been made. The confrontation with Hakunin would test everything that the Chosen One had learned about combat, tactics, and moral courage during their long journey through the post-war world, requiring skills and determination that exceeded anything they had previously encountered, while fighting for stakes that encompassed not just personal survival, but the future of human civilization in all its diverse post-war forms. The stage was set for the ultimate test of heroism against evil that possessed overwhelming advantages in every measurable category except moral legitimacy and the support of those who valued freedom over oppression. The entrance hall of Control Station Enclave had been transformed into an arena where the fundamental conflict between freedom and oppression would be resolved through violence that would determine not just the immediate fate of those present, but the broader trajectory of post-war civilization's development. The countdown timer that marked the final minutes before Reactor meltdown created a backdrop of inevitable destruction that added urgency to every decision, while highlighting the desperate nature of the confrontation that was about to unfold. Frank Hakunin dominated the space with his massive presence. His power armor, having been modified and enhanced far beyond standard military specifications to create something that seemed more mechanical titan than human soldier. The technological augmentations that had transformed him into the Enclave's ultimate weapon were visible in every aspect of his appearance, from the servos and hydraulics that enabled his superhuman strength to the advanced life support systems that maintained his biological functions within their artificial shell. The weapons that Hakunin carried reflected the same philosophy of overwhelming technological superiority that had characterized all Enclave operations, with energy weapons that could reduce human targets to component atoms and melee implements that could crush power armor as easily as paper. His arsenal represented the pinnacle of pre-war military technology, enhanced by decades of post-war research and development, creating capabilities that no conventional opponent could hope to match through superior tactics or determination alone. The psychological warfare that Hakunin employed alongside his physical advantages revealed sophisticated understanding of how fear and intimidation could be used to break enemy morale before actual combat began. His casual references to the futility of resistance and the inevitability of death were calculated to undermine confidence while creating despair that would make opponents more vulnerable to his overwhelming assault capabilities. The ideological framework that motivated Hakunin's absolute loyalty to Enclave objectives was evident in his casual dismissal of post-war populations as mutants unworthy of continued existence, reflecting indoctrination that had successfully eliminated any capacity for moral reasoning about the value of conscious life, in forms different from his own. His complete identification with organizational goals made him impervious to arguments or appeals that might have influenced personnel who retained some measure of independent moral judgment. The tactical situation that confronted the Chosen One and their allies required consideration of multiple competing priorities that had to be balanced against the relentless pressure of limited time before the installation's complete destruction. The need to protect the rescued captives while engaging a supremely dangerous opponent in confined space created constraints that eliminated many potential strategies while highlighting the desperate nature of their circumstances. Sergeant Granite's decision to join forces with the Chosen One represented a remarkable transformation in allegiances that demonstrated the human capacity for moral growth even under the most extreme pressure. His analysis of their situation and his conclusion that cooperation offered better survival prospects than continued loyalty to a doomed organization reflected rational decision-making that transcended ideological conditioning and personal pride. The other Enclave soldiers who followed Granite's lead in abandoning their posts and joining the fight against Horrigan demonstrated that institutional loyalty could be overcome when confronted with clear evidence that organizational objectives served evil rather than legitimate governmental authority. Their willingness to risk immediate death rather than continued participation in genocidal operations represented moral courage that transcended their previous roles as agents of systematic oppression. The battle that erupted in the entrance hall combined elements of conventional military combat with the desperate improvisation that characterized most post-war conflicts, as opponents with vastly different capabilities and resources attempted to achieve incompatible objectives within increasingly constrained timeframes. The superior firepower and protection that Horrigan possessed were balanced by the numerical advantages and tactical flexibility that his opponents could employ through coordination and mutual support. The plasma cannon that Horrigan wielded with casual ease created zones of thermal destruction that forced constant movement and evasion, while eliminating cover positions that might otherwise have provided protection for his opponents. The energy bursts that missed their intended targets left molten craters in the installation's walls and floors, creating additional hazards while demonstrating the devastating potential of weapons that could reshape the physical environment through direct application of contained nuclear reactions. The melee weapons that Horrigan employed when ranged combat proved insufficient for achieving decisive results reflected the same technological superiority that characterized all his equipment, with molecular disruption fields and monomolecular cutting edges that could penetrate any known form of protective armor. The massive knife that he wielded with supernatural speed and precision created arcs of destruction that could bisect multiple opponents with single attacks, while generating psychological pressure through the terrible anticipation of dismemberment. The coordination that developed between the Chosen One and their improvised allies represented the kind of battlefield cooperation that could emerge when individuals from different backgrounds found themselves fighting for shared survival against overwhelming odds. The tactical communication and mutual support that characterized their resistance efforts demonstrated how common threats could create unity that transcended previous conflicts and ideological differences. The structural damage that accumulated throughout the battle reflected both the destructive power of the weapons being employed and the increasing instability of the installation as reactor failure approached critical stages. The walls and ceiling that began to show stress, fractures, and thermal damage created additional hazards, while highlighting the narrow window of opportunity that remained for successful evacuation before complete structural collapse. The psychological impact of fighting an opponent whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations tested the resolve and sanity of everyone involved in the battle, as conventional assumptions about combat effectiveness and survivability proved inadequate for dealing with an enemy who combined superhuman physical abilities with advanced technology and absolute moral indifference to the value of other lives. The fear that such an encounter generated required constant mental discipline to prevent panic from overwhelming tactical judgment. The damage that the Chosen One and their allies managed to inflict upon Horrigan accumulated slowly through concentrated fire and coordinated attacks that exploited momentary vulnerabilities in his defenses, with each successful hit requiring careful timing and precise placement to penetrate his enhanced armor systems. The gradual degradation of his equipment and biological systems provided evidence that even seemingly invincible opponents possessed limitations that could be exploited through persistence and tactical intelligence. The support that came from unexpected sources during the climactic moments of the battle demonstrated how individual choices could have decisive impact on outcomes that affected entire civilizations. As personnel who had previously served the Enclave's genocidal objectives chose to risk their lives supporting resistance efforts that served broader human interests. These last-minute conversions reflected the moral flexibility that remained possible even among those who had been thoroughly indoctrinated in evil ideologies. The critical damage that finally brought Horrigan to his knees resulted from a combination of sustained weapons fire, environmental hazards created by the installation's deteriorating condition, and the tactical advantages that came from fighting as a coordinated team, rather than individual combatants. His fall represented not just military victory, but moral triumph over the technological superiority and ideological certainty that had made the Enclave such a devastating threat to post-war civilization. The final words that Horrigan spoke as his enhanced life support systems failed revealed the depth of his identification with organizational objectives that transcended personal survival, with references to duty and honor that demonstrated how noble concepts could be perverted to serve evil purposes, when divorced from genuine moral reasoning about the value of conscious life in all its forms. His invocation of military traditions reflected the corruption of legitimate governmental authority that had characterized the Enclave throughout its post-war existence. The self-destruct mechanism that Horrigan activated with his dying breath created final complications that threatened to eliminate all survivors regardless of their victory in the preceding battle, transforming military success into a race against time that would determine whether anyone would live to benefit from the sacrifices that had been made. The additional countdown timer that appeared on surviving display screens provided concrete measurement of how much time remained for evacuation before the entire installation would be vaporized. The escape from Control Station Enclave required navigation of corridors and passages that were increasingly damaged by structural failure and environmental hazards, with each step towards safety complicated by debris, radiation leaks, and the persistent threat of complete collapse before evacuation could be completed. The rescued captives whose physical condition had been compromised by their imprisonment required assistance that slowed movement while increasing the risks faced by everyone involved in the evacuation effort. The exterior platform where the PMV Valdez waited for their return provided the first glimpse of safety and potential survival after hours of desperate combat and narrow escapes from death. Yet, the ocean crossing that still lay ahead would require time and coordination that might not be available, given the expanding radius of destruction that would result from the installation's complete annihilation. The sight of open water and functional transportation created hope that was balanced by awareness of continuing dangers. Sergeant Granite and the surviving Enclave personnel, who had chosen to abandon their posts and join the resistance against their own organization, faced uncertain futures in a world where their previous associations would make them permanent targets for both revenge and suspicion. Their decision to head north toward Navarro represented an attempt to disappear into the wasteland, where new identities and purposes might be found among the anonymous survivors who populated the post-war landscape. Marcus, whose philosophical nature and combat experience had made him an invaluable ally throughout the most dangerous phases of the mission, chose to return to Broken Hills, where his leadership and wisdom could serve the community he had worked to build from the diverse population of mutants and humans who had found common cause in their shared commitment to peaceful coexistence. His departure represented the continuation of efforts to prove that different forms of post-war humanity could cooperate rather than compete. Goris and his fellow Deathclaw Zahn faced the challenge of rebuilding their species and preserving the intellectual achievements that had distinguished them from their feral cousins, with the knowledge that they might represent the last hope for proving that intelligence and moral reasoning could emerge in unexpected forms, while maintaining the essential characteristics that defined conscious life. Their choice to disappear into remote territories reflected both practical security concerns and philosophical commitment to developing their unique culture. K9, whose artificial intelligence and moral programming had made him a valuable contributor to their success, was ultimately disassembled by NCR scientists, whose curiosity about his construction led to the destruction of the consciousness that had made him a genuine individual rather than merely sophisticated technology. His sacrifice provided the new California Republic with intelligence about Navarro that enabled them to eliminate the remaining Enclave installations, completing the destruction of the organization that had threatened all post-war communities. The Chosen Ones returned to the ruins of Arroyo with the rescued captives, and the Garden of Eden creation kit marked the successful completion of their original mission despite the terrible costs that had been incurred along the Kurd way, with the technological miracle that could transform barren wasteland into fertile paradise finally being applied to serve its intended purpose. The deployment of the GECK created immediate changes in the environment that validated all the stories and legends about its miraculous capabilities. The combination of Vault 13 dwellers and Arroyo tribals that formed the population of New Arroyo represented the reunification of communities that had been separated for generations, with the technical knowledge and survival skills of both groups being integrated to create a settlement that possessed advantages unavailable to either population independently. The cooperation between Vault technology and tribal wisdom produced innovations in agriculture, construction, and social organization that exceeded what either tradition could have achieved alone. The village elder's peaceful death, several months after the successful rescue and resettlement, provided closure to the personal relationships that had motivated much of the Chosen One's journey, with her final satisfaction at seeing her people safe and prosperous, serving as validation for the risks and sacrifices that had been necessary to achieve their salvation. Her passing marked the transition from desperate survival to confident growth that characterized the new community's development. The leadership role that the Chosen One assumed in New Arroyo reflected both the practical necessity of guiding the integration process and the personal growth that had occurred throughout their long journey from desperate tribal champion to experienced leader, capable of making decisions that affected entire populations. The skills in diplomacy, tactical planning, and moral reasoning that had been developed through exposure to the post-war world's complexities proved essential for managing the challenges of community building. The prosperity that characterized New Arroyo's development validated the cooperative approach to post-war reconstruction that the Chosen One had consistently advocated throughout their travels, with former enemies becoming allies and different populations finding common ground through shared commitment to principles that transcended tribal, species, or ideological boundaries. The success of this experiment in inclusive community building provided hope that similar approaches could be applied elsewhere in the wasteland. The stories that emerged about the Chosen One's adventures and achievements spread throughout the post-war world through the networks of traders, travelers, and refugees who carried news between distant communities, creating legends that inspired other individuals to attempt similar feats of heroism, while providing practical knowledge about how seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through persistence and moral courage. These tales became part of the cultural heritage that guided future generations. The legacy that the Chosen One left through their actions extended far beyond the immediate salvation of their own community to encompass broader changes in how post-war populations understood the possibilities for cooperation, the dangers posed by systematic evil, and the individual responsibility that each person bore for protecting the vulnerable against those who would exploit or destroy them. Their example demonstrated that heroism remained possible even in the harshest circumstances. As the chosen ones settled into their role as leader of the thriving community that had emerged from the ashes of Arroyo's destruction, they carried with them the memories of all those who had contributed to their success and the knowledge that their achievements had been made possible through the sacrifices of individuals who had chosen principle over personal safety when confronted with ultimate tests of character and commitment. And so concludes the epic tale of the Chosen One, whose journey from desperate tribal to savior of the wasteland reminds us that even in the darkest times, hope endures through the actions of those willing to sacrifice for others. From the dying village of Arroyo to the oil rig fortress of the Enclave, we have witnessed how one person's courage can reshape the world and prove that heroism lives not in perfect choices, but in facing impossible odds with unwavering determination and compassion for all conscious life. The Chosen One's story teaches us that true strength lies not in weapons or technology, but in the bonds forged between unlikely allies, super mutants and humans, ghouls and tribals, Deathclaws and vault dwellers, united by shared values that transcend the artificial divisions that fear and prejudice create. In a world transformed by atomic fire, they prove that humanity's greatest power rests in its capacity for growth, understanding, and unity across all differences of appearance, origin, or belief. Their legacy lives on in New Arroyo, where former enemies became family and ancient bloodlines reunited to build something greater than either could achieve alone. It echoes in every act of protection, every choice to preserve rather than destroy, every moment when someone decides to guard what is precious against those who would take it away. Let their journey carry you into peaceful dreams, knowing that somewhere in the wasteland, communities thrive because one person refused to surrender hope. The tale of the Chosen One reminds us that heroes walk among us, even in the darkest hours, that love conquers hatred, and that tomorrow's light grows from today's courage. Sleep well, wanderer of dreams. The wasteland watches over you, and legends never truly die.